Before the compass, before charts and sextants, and magnetic needles, there was only the sea, vast, unknowable, and alive. The first humans who dared to leave the safety of the shore did so not with instruments, but with instinct, courage, and the raw language of the natural world. The ocean was not merely a place, it was a mystery, a force that could cradle or consume. To venture onto it required a kind of faith that modern navigators, with their tools and technology, can scarcely imagine. Picture a coastline tens of thousands of years ago, long before the age of kingdoms and empires, before even the first written words. The sun sets low on the horizon, turning the waves to sheets of molten gold. A group of people stand beside a crude wooden raft or hollowed-out canoe, watching the tide rise. The air smells of salt and smoke. They have no maps, no compass, no promise of return. But something beyond fear drives them forward, curiosity, perhaps, or hunger, or the faint gleam of another island seen in the distance on a clear day. When they push away from the shore, the world changes. The steady ground disappears, replaced by the rhythm of the sea, a constant movement that hums beneath their feet. They learn to listen to it. The sea has a voice, and to survive, one must learn its language. A whisper of wind means a change of direction. The sound of distant waves breaking can mean the presence of land. The tilt of the stars overhead, the rise of the sun, the flight of birds, all of it becomes a code to decipher. In the beginning, navigation was not a science, but an art, and the first navigators were artists of observation. Long before anyone understood the curvature of the earth or the magnetism of the poles, people knew how to read the world as a living map. The shape of clouds told them where land lay beyond the horizon. The color of the water told them whether they sailed over deep or shallow sea. Even the scent of the air could change, dry and crisp in open water, heavy with the smell of soil and plants when land was near. The earliest seafarers came from many lands. In the Mediterranean, the Phoenicians were among the first who mastered the sea. Their sleek ships of cedar carried goods, stories, and ideas from one coast to another. They traced the outlines of Africa and Europe before anyone knew those continents existed. To the east, the ancient Egyptians sailed the Nile and beyond, following the stars and the seasonal winds. In the Pacific, long before Europeans learned to fear the open ocean, the Polynesians were already navigating across distances so vast they seemed impossible, guided not by compasses, but by memory, starlight, and waves. What united them all was their relationship with nature. The ocean was not conquered, it was negotiated with. Every journey was a conversation between human will and natural rhythm. The sailors learned to feel direction, not just with their eyes, but with their entire bodies. They could sense a change in wind pressure on their skin, hear the difference between an open sea and a nearby reef, and tell north from south by the slant of shadows at dawn. At the heart of early navigation was the sky. Long before anyone spoke of astronomy, people understood the heavens as a map. The sun rose and set in a predictable path, and the stars, eternal, unchanging, could guide the lost home again. The North Star, constant above the horizon, became the anchor of the northern hemisphere. In the southern seas, other constellations took its place. The Southern Cross, the Pleiades, Orion's belt. These were not mere ornaments of the night, but signposts in the cosmic ocean. To the ancients, the sea and the sky were mirrors. One reflected the other. To read the stars was to read the waves, and to read the waves was to understand the heavens. The great Polynesian navigators, for instance, memorized entire star lines, invisible highways in the sky that aligned with the directions of ocean swells. At night, they would lie on the deck, eyes fixed on the heavens, feeling the rhythm of the sea beneath them. When clouds hid the stars, they relied on the pattern of waves and the pull of currents, stored in their muscles and bones. In Europe and the Mediterranean, sailors developed their own systems. They hugged the coastlines, keeping land in sight whenever possible, but even then they needed to know where they were. They learned to recognize mountains, cliffs, and bays by their shapes. They gave names to every rock and headland, building a living atlas in their minds. The Mediterranean became a sea of memory, each port connected not by drawn lines on parchment, but by stories and directions spoken aloud. Sail west until the twin peaks rise from the water, a Phoenician might say. Then turn north until you see the temple shining white above the bay. Before charts, there were songs. Among seafaring peoples, directions were not written but sung. The rhythm of oars matched the rhythm of words. A navigator might chant the sequence of islands, winds, and currents, passing the knowledge to apprentices who memorized every verse. These chants were more than instructions. They were history, prayer, and survival all at once. It is hard for us to imagine now how deep their knowledge ran. Without numbers or compasses, they could estimate distance by counting heartbeats or the time it took for certain stars to move across the sky. They understood the subtle relationship between tides and the phases of the moon. They knew that certain birds never flew far from land, and that certain clouds gathered only above islands. They knew the smell of rain before it came, and the taste of wind when storms approached. The sea was both map and teacher, but it was also unforgiving. Many ships were lost, rafts carried off by currents, canoes smashed against unseen reefs. But each failure was a lesson. Every voyage that vanished into the horizon added a new piece to the collective knowledge of those who remained. Navigation evolved not from safety, but from danger, from the need to survive, to return home, to find again what was lost. The first navigators learned the value of patience. They waited for the right wind, the right moon, the right season. In the Pacific, the Polynesians studied the patterns of swells for months before setting sail. In the Mediterranean, sailors waited for calm seas after winter storms. The ocean demanded respect, and those who did not give it paid dearly. Yet for all its danger, the sea was also freedom. It connected worlds that would otherwise have remained strangers. It carried spices, stories, songs, and gods across distances that seemed infinite. Through navigation, however primitive it might seem to us now, the ancient sailors wove the first threads of globalization. Imagine again that first voyage, the canoe cutting through water, the wind filling its sail. The navigator squints toward the setting sun, marking its position. The stars will rise soon, and he will read them like a book. Round him the sea stretches endlessly, dark and alive. He does not know if land waits beyond the horizon, but he trusts what he has learned, the whisper of wind, the rhythm of waves, the path of the stars. That trust, the belief that nature could guide, that the world itself offered directions to those who listened closely, was the foundation of all navigation. Before metal needles pointed north, before maps divided the ocean into coordinates, there was the human spirit and its dialogue with the sea. Over centuries, this relationship deepened. Each voyage expanded the limits of the known world. The first island gave way to archipelagos, the first coast to continents. Knowledge was not stored in books, but in the minds of sailors who saw with the whole of their senses. They passed it on to their apprentices, who in turn refined it generation after generation. By the time the compass was invented, humanity had already learned to travel thousands of miles guided only by the heavens and the sea itself. The compass did not create navigation. It merely made visible what had long been known, that the world could be read, that direction could be felt, that the earth, sky, and sea were one vast map waiting to be understood. In the dark before dawn, a sailor wakes to the sound of gentle waves lapping against the hull. The stars begin to fade, the horizon glows with the promise of day. He rises, stretching stiff limbs, and turns his face to the wind. It is cool and steady from the east. He knows what it means. Without a compass, without even opening his eyes, he knows where he is and where he is going. When night falls upon the ancient seas, the world turns to shadow, except above, where the stars blaze in endless constellations. To the early navigators, this celestial canopy was not random. It was the map of maps, the great and eternal chart by which the seas themselves could be understood. Every voyager who dared to sail beyond the sight of land became, by necessity, a student of the stars. In the silence of open water, the sky became a teacher. The North Star, bright and unwavering, held a place of special reverence for many northern peoples. It was the one point in the heavens that did not move. As the earth turned, all other stars wheeled around it in slow circles, but Polaris remained still, a heavenly nail pinning the sky to the world. For a sailor adrift in the dark, it was a beacon, constant, reliable, the very definition of direction. To find north was to find one's place in the universe. Yet for all the mystique of the North Star, not every culture had it. The Polynesians, sailing the southern seas, saw other guides in the night. They followed the Southern Cross and the Pleiades, the Seven Sisters, which shimmered like jewels scattered across the heavens. These stars were not just ornaments. They marked the seasons, the winds, and the paths between islands separated by hundreds of miles. Each constellation told a story, and each story contained a direction. To memorize the sky was a lifetime's work. Polynesian navigators, known as wayfinders, trained voyagers under master sailors who taught them through oral tradition. They learned to recognize hundreds of stars and to remember their rising and setting points on the horizon. To them, the night sky was divided into sectors, invisible houses through which stars traveled. When a specific star rose from a certain point, it signaled the way to a particular island. The navigator, lying on the deck, would track it with his eyes until dawn. This knowledge was never written. It lived in memory, in chants, and songs that encoded astronomical wisdom in rhythm and rhyme. A chant might go, "When Tikiva rises in the east, steer your canoe toward its breath until you see the white bird of land." Such phrases carried practical meaning. Tikiva might be a name for a specific star, and the white bird a cloud formation that hovered above a distant island. In this way, myth and science blended seamlessly. The cosmos was both sacred and functional, the gods and stars indistinguishable in purpose. To navigate was to participate in creation itself, to read the divine patterns written across the sky. Every voyage was a reenactment of origin, the sea as birth, the stars as destiny. But how did they actually use the stars to move through an endless ocean? The method was simple in concept, yet profound in practice. Imagine standing on a canoe at night. The horizon forms a circle around you, your 360-degree compass. The navigator selects a steering star, one whose rising or setting aligns with the desired direction of travel. As long as that star stays in the chosen spot relative to the canoe's prow, the vessel remains on course. When the star climbs too high or dips below the horizon, another is chosen, a relay of celestial beacons, one handing the journey to the next. In the vastness of the Pacific, where islands could be mere dots lost in thousands of miles of ocean, this system was astonishingly accurate. A trained navigator could sense when his path was drifting simply by the position of a star's reflection in the waves. He did not measure angles or take notes. He felt the difference through eyes, ears, and skin. European sailors, centuries later, developed similar relationships with the stars, though they recorded their knowledge differently. The Greeks and Phoenicians charted the heavens meticulously, mapping constellations and calculating their movements. Greek astronomers like Pythagoras and later Hipparchus began to theorize about the Earth's shape and axis, ideas that would eventually transform navigation. Yet even as they moved toward mathematical precision, their methods still rested on the same foundation: observation, repetition, and trust in the night sky. To the Egyptians, the stars were gods sailing the river of heaven. The great pyramids themselves were aligned with celestial points, proof of how deeply they studied the heavens. Egyptian sailors used the same logic when traveling the Nile and venturing into the Red Sea. At night, they followed star lines just as Polynesians did, though they had their own sacred constellations. The star Sirius, for instance, not only marked direction, but foretold the annual flooding of the Nile. Across the world, the art of sky reading took on many forms, but its essence was universal. To navigate meant to know the cosmos intimately, not as an abstraction, but as a living system that mirrored one's own existence. The sailor's world was divided between above and below, the sky and the sea, both fluid, both eternal. When clouds obscured the heavens, the navigator turned to other clues. The sea itself became a secondary sky, with its own constellations of movement and light. The direction of swells, the color of the water, the flight of birds at dawn, all hinted at what the stars would have told. In this sense, early navigators possessed a kind of synesthetic awareness. The senses blended. The sound of waves informed sight, the tilt of wind informed direction. It was a knowledge that lived in the body as much as in the mind. Among the most remarkable techniques was wave piloting, practiced by navigators of the Marshall Islands and Micronesia. These sailors could read the pattern of ocean swells with almost supernatural precision. They memorized the rhythm of waves, how they rose and fell, how they refracted off unseen islands or underwater ridges. Even when land was hundreds of miles away, its presence could be felt in the interference patterns of the sea. To the untrained eye, the ocean was chaos. To the wave pilot, it was geometry made liquid. They built what were called stick charts, frameworks of curved reeds tied together with coconut fibers, each representing a pattern of swells, currents, and islands. The stick chart was not a map in the modern sense, but a memory device, a way to encode knowledge that could not be written in words. Before a voyage, the navigator would study it by touch, tracing the lines with his fingers until he could feel the sea through memory alone. Then, when the chart was left behind, his mind became the map. In these early civilizations, navigation was not a profession but a sacred calling. The navigator stood at the center of life and death. His skill could mean the survival of an entire community. He was both scientist and priest. His authority derived from a harmony with nature that others could not fully comprehend. When he said it was time to sail, they trusted him without question. As humanity expanded its reach, the stars guided not only travel but imagination. They inspired myths of gods who crossed the heavens in golden ships, of heroes who followed star paths to lost worlds. In truth, those myths reflected real journeys, the voyages of people who, without compasses or charts, crossed thousands of miles guided by faith in the firmament. Even today, when satellites and GPS can pinpoint a position to within a few feet, there remains something profoundly humbling in the ancient art of celestial navigation. It reminds us that the universe once spoke to us directly, and we listened, not through instruments, but through intuition. In the middle of the night, far from land, imagine standing on the deck of a small vessel. The wind is steady, the waves rhythmically whispering against the hull. Above, the stars burn with fierce clarity. The navigator raises his hand, aligning his finger with a point of light just above the horizon. There, he murmurs our path. No compass, no clock, no chart, just that point of light, and the endless dark ocean beneath. Yet it is enough. For those who learned to read the sky, the universe was never silent. It was a map, ancient, infinite, and alive. If the stars were the eyes of heaven, then the sea itself was its voice, a restless, ever-shifting symphony of motion that spoke in patterns few could decipher. Long before humanity charted magnetic north or measured longitude, sailors had learned that the ocean was not a random chaos of water, but a vast, living system governed by rhythm. To cross it without instruments required learning to hear that rhythm, to sense its hidden order in the way a musician hears the pulse beneath a song. The earliest seafarers understood this truth intuitively. They did not separate sky from sea, wind from water, or human from nature. For them, every voyage was a conversation with the world, one in which the waves spoke, and the navigator answered. When a canoe or ship left shore, it entered a realm of invisible forces, currents that pulled unseen beneath the surface. winds that danced across the waves, tides that rose and fell with the breathing of the moon. To survive, a sailor had to become fluent in this language, to know how to read it, how to trust it, and, when necessary, how to challenge it. The language of currents. Currents are the invisible highways of the sea. They are the great circulatory system of the planet, carrying warm and cold water across thousands of miles, shaping weather, migration, and even human destiny. For ancient mariners, they were both peril and promise, unseen rivers within the ocean that could carry a ship home or drag it forever off course. The Polynesians, whose canoes stitched together the vast expanse of the Pacific, learned to feel these currents through touch and observation. They could tell the direction of a current not by looking at the surface, which often deceived, but by trailing their hands in the water, feeling the pull against their skin. A subtle temperature difference, a faint change in the color of the sea, the way seaweed drifted, each was a clue. In the Indian Ocean, Arab sailors mastered the monsoon currents long before Europeans ever dared those waters. They knew that the sea itself changed direction with the seasons. The southwest monsoon winds carried them toward India in summer, and the northeast winds brought them home again in winter. These patterns became the heartbeat of trade between Arabia, Africa, and Asia. Spices, silk, and stories flowed with the rhythm of the earth's breathing. Even in the Mediterranean, where distances were smaller, sailors watched the way water moved along the coastlines. They learned that the surface current might push east, while a deeper one flowed west. A skilled navigator could use these layers like invisible oars, choosing depth and direction to conserve energy or outrun a storm. The grammar of the wind. If currents were the sea's slow rivers, then wind was its voice, capricious, powerful, and alive. To sail without a compass meant knowing the wind by scent, sound, and touch. The earliest navigators did not measure wind with instruments. They felt it. They knew when it shifted by the pressure on their cheeks, by the tone of rigging strings, by the way the sail quivered like the skin of an animal sensing danger. In the Pacific, navigators gave winds names and personalities. Each had a temperament, some gentle, some mischievous, some cruel. A warm wind from the northeast might mean good weather, while a cool gust from the southwest could herald storms. These were not abstractions. They were companions on the voyage, sometimes friends, sometimes foes. The Vikings, sailing their dragon-headed ships across the North Atlantic, relied on wind as both guide and trial. They learned to read clouds for signs, the high cirrus clouds that whispered of fair days, the low gray masses that warned of sudden squalls. A Viking captain might sniff the air and declare, "The wind smells of ice, we turn south," long before any chill touched the sails. The Mediterranean sailors, too, had their catalogue of winds. The Greeks named them with mythic reverence. Boreas, the cold wind from the north; Notos, the wet south wind; Zephyrus, the gentle breeze of the west; and Eurus, the unpredictable east wind. The Romans inherited this lore and built their sea routes around it. In truth, these poetic names masked a sophisticated meteorological understanding, the kind that came not from science, but from centuries of observation. To ancient mariners, the wind was both tool and teacher. They learned to tack against it, to harness its fury, to wait in stillness when it vanished. They knew that the ocean's breath followed the sun's path, that as the day warmed, the air rose and pulled new breezes from the sea only to reverse again at night. These diurnal rhythms became part of their mental maps. The rhythm of waves. Perhaps the most mysterious part of the sea's language was the waves, those endless undulations that seemed to move with purpose even when the wind had died. To most, waves were mere motion. To the navigator, they were direction, memory, and warning. Every swell carries a story. It may have been born hundreds of miles away, where storms once churned the water into motion. That energy travels across the ocean long after the clouds have cleared, forming a signature pattern, the distant echo of weather far beyond the horizon. A trained navigator could read these patterns and know not only which way the wind had blown days ago, but where that wind had come from. The Polynesians were masters of this art. They could sense cross swells, the interference of two or more wave systems colliding. When one swell came from the east and another from the north, they knew that two weather systems had met. The wayfinder would stand barefoot on the deck, knees slightly bent, feeling the motion of the canoe through his bones. His body became an instrument, tuned to the sea's invisible geometry. In the Marshall Islands, navigators built wave charts, delicate frameworks of palm ribs lashed with coconut fiber, each curve representing the direction and intersection of swells. The islands themselves were marked with shells, but the true purpose of the chart was not reference, it was memory. Once learned, the chart was set aside, its knowledge absorbed into the mind. The sea, not parchment, was the true teacher. In the Atlantic, too, sailors learned to read waves. Portuguese and Basque fishermen noted the difference between the long, rolling groundswell of the open sea and the short, choppy waves that warned of nearby shoals. They could hear danger in the sound of surf long before it was visible, the muted roar of waves breaking on unseen reefs. The art of listening. To modernize, this ancient knowledge seems mystical, almost supernatural. How could one sense direction through water and air alone? Yet the truth was practical. Centuries of cumulative observation passed through memory, ritual, and experience. Navigation without instruments required not only intelligence, but intimacy, a lifelong dialogue with the natural world. For these early sailors, knowledge was not written in ink but lived through the senses. It was the smell of seaweed carried on the wind, the rhythm of a bird's wings at dawn, the taste of the air before rain. A navigator's body was his compass, his mind his chart, his faith his sail. At dusk, as the waves glowed orange under the fading sun, a Polynesian navigator might dip his hand into the water and whisper a chant to the ocean. The rhythm of the words matched the pulse of the sea, reminding him of his place within it. When the stars rose, he would align his canoe with a familiar constellation. When clouds veiled the heavens, he would close his eyes and listen to the swell, to the breath of the wind, to the deep, living heartbeat of the earth. He was never lost, not truly, for to those who could hear the ocean's voice, every current, every breeze, every ripple was a sign. The sea itself was the map, and the world, for all its immensity, was home. When clouds swallowed the stars and fog erased the horizon, the ancient navigator faced his greatest test. Without sight of land or sky, without the gleam of constellations to guide him, he sailed in a world made of gray and silence. Yet even then, he was not blind. He carried within his mind a map, not drawn in ink, but calculated in rhythm, instinct, and experience. This was the art of dead reckoning, the invisible mathematics of movement, the way to measure distance and direction when the world gave no clues. Dead reckoning began with memory. The navigator remembered where he had last seen a fixed point, an island, a star, a mountain, and from there, he imagined every mile that passed beneath his keel. He estimated the distance traveled by the feel of the waves, the strength of the wind, and the time that had elapsed. To know one's place was to know how long one had moved, and in what direction. Before clocks, sailors measured time by the pulse of the day. They watched the sun's arc and counted heartbeats or breaths between the rise and fall of the waves. A seasoned navigator could judge speed by the hum of water along the hull, or by how long it took foam to drift from bow to stern. These were not precise calculations by modern standards. They were living estimates, honed through generations of trial and error. Imagine a navigator aboard a Phoenician ship, the wind pressing against the square sail, the water hissing below. He stands at the prow, squinting into the mist, and calls back to his helmsman, "Hold steady to the west. Keep the wind at your left shoulder. Hours pass." He marks time by the rhythm of his oarsman's chants, by the creak of wood, by the sun's glow behind the clouds. Though he cannot see the coast, he knows where he is, within a few degrees of his intended line. His mind is an invisible compass, his memory a moving map. The technique may seem simple, But it was an act of extraordinary concentration. The navigator was not only steering through water, he was calculating in his head, constantly adjusting for drift, wind, and current. Every gust, every subtle turn of the helm altered his imagined position. His thoughts moved like waves, always in motion, recalculating, correcting, refining. Among the Vikings, this method became almost legendary. When the longships crossed from Norway to Iceland, and from there to Greenland and beyond, they had no compass to guide them. They relied instead on a mental ledger of distance and direction. The helmsman stood near the tiller, facing the sail, and gauged their speed by the wake sound and the wind's angle. He might measure time by dropping a piece of wood into the sea and watching how long it took to pass the length of the ship. This crude yet reliable trick gave him the basis for estimating speed, and from speed came distance. If the wind shifted or a storm pushed them off course, the Viking navigator recalculated, blending memory with intuition. The sea taught him to think not in lines and numbers, but in movements and relationships. He could not see his path, but he could feel it. Far to the south, Arab and Indian Ocean sailors refined similar methods, enhanced by their understanding of seasonal monsoons. They tracked their journeys by combining wind direction, estimated speed, and knowledge of currents. Their reckoning was not only dead, it was alive with observation. They recorded the number of days sailed between ports in poetic phrases: 3 days with a full wind from the northeast, or 2 nights with the stars of the lion above our mast. These verbal formulas became a navigational code, flexible enough to survive in memory, accurate enough to map the sea. In Europe's later centuries, dead reckoning evolved into a formal discipline. Sailors began to use log lines, ropes knotted at regular intervals, attached to a wooden board shaped like a slice of pie. The board was tossed into the sea behind the ship, and the rope ran out freely for a set time, measured by an hourglass. The number of knots that passed through the sailors' hands in that time gave a measure of the vessel's speed, hence the nautical term knots that we still use today. But long before these tools existed, the principle was the same. A sailor could know where he was not by seeing, but by remembering where he had been. It required trust in his own senses, in the steadiness of his crew, and in the sea's patterns. It was a fragile trust, tested each time the world went dark. The dance between knowledge and imagination. Dead reckoning demanded imagination as much as precision. The navigator pictured his voyage as a continuous line drawn across the unseen sea. Each gust of wind, each change of sail, each wave that struck the hull altered that line. To keep track of it required total awareness, a kind of meditative focus in which every sensation became information. In this state, the sailor merged with his environment. The ocean was no longer an enemy or obstacle. It was a vast moving instrument, and he was its reader. Even without sight, he knew when he drifted northward, when the current pulled west, when the boat turned a fraction too far from its course. His body was his compass. His heartbeat marked the world's rhythm. The Polynesians developed a variation of this practice so refined that it bordered on the miraculous. Their long voyages across the Pacific, journeys of thousands of miles between tiny islands, were guided by Adak, a mental navigation system that blended dead reckoning with celestial reference. In Adak, the navigator did not think of the canoe as moving across the ocean. Instead, he imagined the canoe as stationary and the islands moving beneath the sky. Each island passed under a specific star, and when that star aligned with the canoe's imagined position, the navigator marked a stage of the voyage. It was a brilliant psychological reversal. By making the ship still and the world mobile, the navigator anchored himself in an otherwise shifting universe. Time and space became flexible, continuous, a cycle of motion perceived through rhythm rather than measurement. The fragility of the mind's compass. But the system was not foolproof. When storms raged for days and nights, when clouds obscured the sun and stars, even the greatest navigator could lose his sense of movement. Without visual cues, the mind's compass began to drift. The rhythm of waves could deceive, and currents could twist the ship off its imagined path. Many of the ocean's mysteries, the legends of ghost ships and vanished fleets, likely began as failures of dead reckoning. A ship might believe itself close to home only to find at dawn that it had sailed hundreds of miles off course. To navigate by mind alone was to live in tension between knowledge and doubt, between mastery and surrender. In those moments, the navigator's greatest strength was humility. He listened more closely to the sea, to the wind, to the feel of the vessel beneath him. He adjusted, recalibrated, waited for a glimpse of the sun or the rise of a familiar star to confirm his guesses. When the sky finally cleared and the constellations returned, he would either find his course blessedly true or discover that he had been deceived by the ocean's invisible hand. And yet, even in error, there was progress. Every mistake became part of collective wisdom, remembered and taught so that others would not repeat it. A new current would be marked in story, a hidden reef named, a wind given a warning title. Over centuries, these fragments of human experience formed a tapestry of practical knowledge, a living map written in memory, sweat, and salt, the invisible art. To modern sailors, with their GPS screens glowing in digital certainty, dead reckoning seems primitive, but it was one of humanity's purest intellectual achievements, the act of mapping the world without ever seeing it. It demanded the union of sensory skill, mathematics, memory, and imagination. It required not the submission of nature to human will, but the harmonization of human awareness with nature's flow. In the silence of the ocean, when all landmarks vanished and the horizon merged with the sky, dead reckoning was not just a technique, it was a philosophy. It taught patience, trust, and the courage to keep going even when the world gave no sign. It taught that direction is not always visible, that sometimes the way forward is known only by the heart's steady pulse and the mind's unbroken faith. As dawn breaks after a long, starless night, the navigator sees the first glow on the horizon. He stands at the stern, face turned toward the wind, and smiles. His mental map, the invisible line traced in memory, has led him true. The sea at last rewards his listening. He nods once, not to the heavens, but to the ocean itself, his oldest companion, his teacher, and his test. Before iron needles floated in bowls of water, before the word magnetism existed, sailors still found their way by listening to the earth itself. The world whispered directions through the flight of birds, the patterns of waves, the color of the sky, and the taste of the wind. What seems mystical now was to them a daily conversation, the sea speaking through signs. These were not superstitions, but systems of observation so deep and practiced that even when stars and land disappeared, nature still provided a map. When a navigator rose before dawn, he didn't just look at the horizon. He felt the air. A shift in temperature could reveal the coming of a coastline. A faint, earthy scent carried on the wind meant that land was near, even if no mountains were visible. The presence of floating seaweed, driftwood, or certain birds gave clues to proximity and direction. In this way, the sailor's senses became his instruments. The sea was his laboratory, the sky his compass rose. The language of the birds. Of all natural guides, birds were perhaps the most trusted. Ancient sailors across the world learned to read the habits of seabirds with almost supernatural accuracy. In the Pacific, Polynesian navigators observed that some species of terns and frigate birds would leave their island roosts at dawn to feed, flying outward in specific directions, and return by evening. By following their morning flights, a navigator could infer which direction led to land. When the crew of a voyaging canoe released a captured bird and saw it circle and fly off in a straight line, they knew it was flying home, a living arrow pointing to safety. The Vikings, too, knew this trick. The sagas tell of Floki Vilgararsson, the first Norseman said to reach Iceland. Unsure of his course, Floki carried ravens aboard his ship. When he released the first, it flew in circles and returned, a sign that no land was nearby. The second flew north, then returned, The third flew west and did not come back, leading Floki in that direction, and to Iceland's shores. The bird, sacred to Odin, became the Norsemen's compass long before lodestones guided their way. Even in the Mediterranean, sailors paid attention to avian movement. Greek and Phoenician mariners believed that certain migratory birds always flew along predictable routes. Spotting them high above the sea told a navigator not only the change of seasons, but the direction of continents. These living barometers helped define safe sailing windows. When winds were favorable and tempests less frequent, the sea's patterns, reading the waves. If birds guided the sky, the waves guided the water. Ancient sailors could read the motion of the ocean as fluently as one might read a text. To an untrained eye, waves look chaotic. To a seasoned navigator, they carry direction, memory, and geography. Across the Pacific, Polynesian navigators learned the language of swell patterns, the deep, rolling waves that persist long after the wind that created them has died. Each swell comes from a particular direction and has its own rhythm. When two or more swells meet, they form distinct cross patterns on the surface. A navigator lying in the bottom of his canoe, eyes closed, could feel these patterns through the hull. By knowing which swell came from which part of the ocean, he could determine his bearing even when clouds hid the stars. This art reached such refinement that Pacific navigators could identify islands hundreds of miles away by the way swells bent around them. They built stick charts to record these patterns, delicate frameworks of palm ribs tied together with shells marking islands, and curved sticks representing the bending of wave lines. These charts were not maps to be read on the sea, they were memory devices. Once a navigator studied them on land, the knowledge became internal. At sea, he relied solely on sensation. In the Indian Ocean, Arab sailors observed similar truths. The behavior of the sea under certain monsoon winds revealed how currents would shift. They knew when the water became warmer or more turbid, land was approaching. The presence of long, low swells moving in a steady rhythm could indicate open ocean, while confused, choppy seas might signal nearby reefs. The ocean spoke through texture as much as motion. The compass of the sky. Even when clouds covered the heavens, the sky still carried direction. Ancient navigators could read the shape and color of clouds as markers of distance and geography. Over islands and coral atolls, moisture rising from the land formed distinctive cloud formations, large, stationary, and bright at the base. By contrast, clouds over open sea were smaller and less defined. A trained eye could distinguish these differences from dozens of miles away. At night, when stars vanished behind a veil of mist, sailors sometimes looked for faint glows along the horizon, what they called sea phosphorescence or ocean fire. The phenomenon, caused by bioluminescent plankton, often appeared stronger near shallow waters or coral reefs. To some, it was a scientific clue, to others, a spiritual sign that the sea itself was lighting their way. Even the color of the sky during sunset and dawn told stories. A crimson horizon might warn of incoming winds. A pale golden glow could mean calm weather and clear visibility. The sailors didn't just notice beauty, they read it, decoding the subtle fingerprints of nature's rhythm, the taste and smell of the world. When all else failed, the navigator could trust his senses of taste and smell. The ocean is not uniform. Near river mouths, its water turns slightly brackish. Near coral reefs, it feels warmer and carries a faint sweetness. Experienced mariners dipped their hands or cups into the sea, tasting its difference. Some could tell, within reasonable accuracy, whether land was near based on this alone. Smell, too, was a guiding force. As the wind shifted, it carried scents across vast distances. The metallic tang of rain, the resin of pine forests, the dry dust of deserts. For sailors long at sea, these faint odors struck like a revelation. In ancient Chinese records, navigators described smelling land before seeing it. The scent of flowers, even faint, meant that the wind had brushed against some far-off island before reaching their sails. When nature went silent, but there were times when the sea fell mute, when fog thickened and wind died, when birds vanished and the air became still, the sailor entered a kind of sensory void. These were the moments of deepest trial. The ocean seemed endless, stripped of every sign. The navigator's instincts turned inward. He had to remember every cue he had collected before silence fell. Sometimes the crew lost faith, fearing they had strayed into the world's edge. In such hours, the navigator's calm became their only anchor. He would remind them that the sea never stayed silent forever, that even stillness had patterns, that every change was a clue. Eventually, the wind would return, or a star would pierce the fog, or a distant bird would cry out, and the world's map would reappear, one sign at a time. The science beneath the mystery. To modernize, these ancient techniques seem almost magical, but beneath the poetry lay a deep, empirical truth. Centuries of cumulative observation, repeated and verified across generations. A Polynesian navigator's skill, for instance, came from memorizing thousands of tiny details, wave frequency, star paths, migratory patterns, and seasonal winds all linked in one mental system. The data set was immense, though transmitted orally, never written down. In many ways, these early mariners were scientists without the word. They tested hypotheses every time they sailed, adjusted their models, refined their understanding of the natural world. The ocean was both their teacher and their testing ground. What they discovered, above all, was that the earth itself offers guidance to those who pay attention. The magnetic compass, when it arrived, did not replace nature, it merely translated what they already knew into metal and motion. The tools changed, but the conversation between sailor and sea endured. The navigator's prayer. When night returned, the navigator would stand beneath the stars, the ship gently rocking, the wind whispering through the rigging. He would murmur quiet prayer, not to demand direction, but to thank the world for its signs. He understood that to navigate was not to conquer the sea, but to join it, to move with it rather than against it. He had no compass in his hand, yet he carried one in his mind, a living instrument made of wind, water, and faith. He trusted that even when the world seemed directionless, it always held a pattern, and that to listen deeply enough was to find one's way home. When night spread its endless curtain over the sea, and the world turned silver under the moon, the ancient navigator looked up. Above him stretched not emptiness, but a living map. Every light in the sky, every star, every cluster, every streak of dust in the Milky Way carried meaning. To modernize, the stars may seem decorative, silent and still, but to the mariner without compass or clock, they were roads. They turned the vastness of the ocean into a navigable landscape. The sea at night was a mirror, and the stars were its script. The navigator knew how to read that script as one might read a sacred text. Each constellation was not just a pattern of light. It was a direction, a memory, a story handed down across centuries. The eternal North. The most faithful companion of all was the North Star, known in the North Atlantic as Polaris. It is a small, quiet light, not the brightest in the sky, yet it remains fixed, unwavering, while all other stars appear to revolve around it. To find it was to find one's anchor in the heavens. For Viking sailors and medieval mariners alike, Polaris was the spine of direction. When the navigator located it, he could determine not only north but also latitude, his distance from the equator, simply by measuring how high it stood above the horizon. If Polaris rose higher each night, the ship was moving northward. If it sank, the ship was drifting south. The Vikings likely used a tool called a sun shadow board or solskjærgirftel during the day, and their eyes and instincts at night. Later, medieval sailors developed a Jacob's staff, a wooden rod with a sliding crosspiece, to measure the altitude of the North Star with rough accuracy. Even before these tools, the naked eye could serve. A navigator might measure with his hand. A finger's width of star above the horizon could mark one day's journey. a rough yet functional geometry of travel. The southern heavens. But the North Star could not guide everyone. Sailors near the equator found it sinking lower each night, and beyond the southern tropics, it vanished entirely. There, other constellations took its place. The Southern Cross, a sharp and brilliant group of 4 stars that pointed toward the celestial south. Polynesian navigators knew it well, so did Arab sailors crossing to East Africa and Indian traders coasting toward Java. By aligning their sails with the Southern Cross or its neighboring constellations, they could maintain direction across thousands of miles. Even when individual stars dipped below the horizon, the memory of their paths remained, a rhythm known by heart. The star paths of the Pacific. No people mastered the stars more completely than the Polynesians. Their voyages across the world's largest ocean, from Tahiti to Hawaii, from Samoa to New Zealand, were guided not by instruments, but by a complex and exacting system of star paths. For them, the night sky was not flat, it was a dome of motion, a rotating clock. Each star rose at a specific point on the horizon, traveled its arc, and set at another precise point. By memorizing these rising and setting points, navigators could determine direction with astonishing accuracy. A single voyage might require the memorization of hundreds of stars, grouped into families and seasonal patterns. Navigators would recite them aloud in rhythmic chants. Hercules rises here, setting there. Aldebaran to the east, Canopus to the south. The chant was not only a mnemonic, it was a living instrument, a human compass encoded in song. When sailing east or west, they followed the rising or setting points of specific stars. When sailing north or south, they noted the changing height of those stars above the horizon. The method was dynamic, the dialogue between motion and memory, between sea and sky. The Polynesian navigator Tupaia, who joined Captain James Cook's first Pacific voyage in the 18th century, astonished European sailors by drawing a mental map of the ocean that covered thousands of miles, linking islands they had never seen but which he knew from oral tradition. His knowledge was not written on paper, but carried in the constellations and the songs that described them. The Mediterranean sky and its stories. In the Mediterranean, the sea that gave birth to Greek myth and Roman Empire, the stars also served as faithful guides. The constellation Ursa Major, the Great Bear, was central to ancient navigation. Its brightest stars formed the plow or wagon, and 2 of them pointed directly to Polaris. Homer, in the Odyssey, describes how Odysseus kept the bear on his left hand as he sailed home, a poetic instruction for maintaining a northward course while heading west. The Phoenicians, those tireless traders and explorers, were among the first to systematically study stellar navigation. Greek historians wrote that they sailed by the Little Bear, referring to Ursa Minor, the constellation containing Polaris. In contrast, Greek sailors typically followed the larger Great Bear, which was easier to identify but slightly less precise. This distinction shows how deeply practical observation shaped different seafaring traditions. Arab astronomers later refined these systems, giving precise names and positions to stars, many of which we still use today: Aldebaran, Altair, Betelgeuse, Rigel, Vega. Their records transformed what had been lore into a proto-science, navigation by celestial mechanics before the word mechanics even existed. Reading time from the sky. The stars gave not only direction, but also time. The night sky was a clock that rotated with perfect regularity. A sailor could tell how far the night had advanced by noting which constellations had risen or set. On long voyages, this ability to measure time was as crucial as knowing where one was. Before mechanical timekeeping, navigation depended on such observation. The rising of a certain star before dawn might signal the coming of a new season or the shift of monsoon winds. The appearance of the Pleiades, the 7 sisters, marked the start of the agricultural year in many cultures and the sailing season in others. The sea, the stars, and the calendar were one system. To read one was to understand the others. The art of memory. Because they had no written charts, navigators used their minds as libraries. They memorized star compasses, with each horizon divided into dozens of named points corresponding to the rising and setting stars. In training, young apprentices would lie on the beach at night, staring at the sky until they could trace each star's path by instinct. Their teachers might ask, "Where does Sirius rise? Where does it set? What follows it?" The student would answer by pointing, reciting, visualizing. Over years, these lessons formed a total map of the heavens, not abstract, but lived and felt. The night sky became a companion, not just a tool. The navigator did not look at the stars, he looked through them, seeing his course, his home, and his people written there. When the heavens betrayed, yet even the stars could deceive. Clouds could obscure them for days. Storms might twist their perceived motion. In some parts of the world, refraction near the horizon made stars appear higher or lower than they truly were. When such distortions occurred, the navigator had to rely on experience, the memory of rhythm, and the feel of the wind. Some legends tell of sailors who mistook false stars, guiding their ships into peril. Others tell of navigators who followed the heavens faithfully through darkness and storm, trusting that once the sky cleared, their course would prove true. In either case, the stars were not merely guides, they were judges of a sailor's patience and faith. The cosmic connection. To navigate by the stars was to live in harmony with the universe. Each voyage mirrored the cosmic dance, the turning of the earth beneath the heavens, the cycle of night and day, of seasons and return. The sailor understood, even if he could not explain, that the stars moved with order and meaning. In the end, this sense of cosmic rhythm became a spiritual anchor. When alone on the sea surrounded by darkness, the navigator looked upward and saw the same constellations that had guided his ancestors. The heavens were both map and memory, proof that even in the boundless ocean, humankind had a place, a direction, and a story written in light. The ship rocked gently under the stars. The navigator stood at the stern, his eyes following the arc of Polaris, his hand resting on the tiller. Around him stretched the black water, glimmering with faint reflection. Above him, the universe wheeled in silence. He did not need a compass. The stars were enough. They had always been enough. Long before compasses pointed north, the wind itself was direction. To ancient sailors, the sky's invisible currents were both map and master, friend and adversary. They knew that to navigate the sea was to understand the air, to listen not only to what blew through the sails, but to what whispered across continents and seasons. Each gust carried a message, from where it came, to where it would go, and what path it opened or closed. The sea, in its vast silence, was shaped by wind, and the sailor, to survive, had to learn the rhythm of that invisible dance. The world according to wind. The Greeks divided the world by 8 principal winds, the anemoi, each one given a name, a season, a spirit. Boreas howled from the north, bringing cold and storms. Notus came from the south, heavy with rain. Eurus blew from the east, dry and erratic, while zephyrs from the west brought gentle breezes and the promise of spring. For them, the winds were not just meteorological forces. They were divine personalities. Temples stood in their honor. In Athens, the Tower of the Winds still rises, an octagonal marble clock tower adorned with carvings of each animal. Mariners consulted it as a calendar of the sky, knowing which winds ruled each month. To a Greek helmsman setting sail from Corinth or Rhodes, to know the name of the wind was to know fate. He could read the day's destiny by the air's scent and movement, whether Boreas would drive him toward Italy or cast him back against the cliffs of Crete. Centuries later, Arab sailors on the Indian Ocean used their own system, the monsoon, a word derived from the Arabic mosin, meaning season. They discovered that the world's breath was not random. It changed with the earth's tilt and the sun's heat. For half the year, winds blew steadily from the northeast, driving ships from Arabia and India toward East Africa. Then, as the planet shifted its balance, the winds reversed, carrying them home. This cyclical gift allowed commerce, exploration, and pilgrimage across thousands of miles of open ocean, all without compass or chart. The sailors simply waited for the season to turn. The sea itself announced the time to go. The mind as compass. To medieval sailors, wind direction became the framework for navigation. The wind rose, precursor to the modern compass rose, mapped the known winds into 12, then 16, and finally 32 points, each representing a specific direction of the breeze. Early maps, like those drawn by Italian and Catalan cartographers, were covered with radiating lines crossing its central points, the wrong lines of wind courses. A sailor might not know latitude or longitude, but he knew his wind. A Venetian pilot would say, "We sail under the Greco," meaning northeast, or "We run before the Libeccio," meaning southwest. These wind names became the vocabulary of travel, as precise to them as numerical degrees are to us. In the North Atlantic, Viking mariners used their own system. They spoke not of abstract points, but of land winds, sea winds, and storm winds. They knew when a southern breeze smelled of pine forests, meaning it came from Norway, and when a northerly brought the cold breath of ice. The Polynesians, too, built a wind compass. Each island chain had its unique vocabulary for the breezes that defined its geography. In Samoa, the steady trade winds were tualoa, the backbone of the sea. In Hawaii, the gentle onshore breeze was malanai, while the fierce offshore gusts were kaiolu. Every name carried both direction and personality, the scent and sound of air. Before the compass, the air itself was an instrument. Experienced sailors could hear changes in wind long before they felt them. A rising hum in the rigging, a different rhythm in the waves, a tremor in the sails, all foretold a shift. The navigator's ear was as important as his eye. At dawn, the wind's character told stories of the coming day. A soft breeze with salt taste meant calm weather. A dry, electric scent hinted at distant storms. Over time, sailors came to recognize that air carried memory. A hot wind off Africa, the Sirocco, could travel north 4 days, carrying dust that reddened the sky over Italy. From the west, the Mistral of France arrived suddenly, fierce and cold, capable of overturning boats and spirits alike. In northern waters, where fog often muffled vision, sound became a compass. The roar of waves breaking against unseen cliffs revealed direction and distance. Even the tone of the sea's voice changed with the wind's shift, a deep rumble in the south, a high hiss in the north. When wind became a lie, sailing without a compass was not merely a challenge of orientation. It was a dance of timing. To catch the right wind meant life. To misjudge it meant disaster. Ancient traders learned to plan entire voyages around seasonal winds. The Phoenicians and Carthaginians scheduled their Mediterranean journeys between the equinoxes, when the sea was friendliest and winds predictable. The Arab merchants of Oman and Yemen timed their departures to match the monsoon reversal, ensuring that they would reach India in summer and return by winter. Even the Vikings, often seen as storm chasers, were careful readers of the sky. They waited for Hafgola, the sea calm of early summer, before launching across the North Atlantic. A journey from Norway to Iceland required the cooperation of the southwesterlies, a wind that might last only a few weeks. This alliance between man and air became ritualized. Before departure, sailors offered prayers to the gods of wind, to Eolus in the Mediterranean, Njord among the Norse, and Tangaroa in the Pacific. They asked not for safety, but for cooperation, a fair breeze, a steady hand from the heavens. When wind became enemy, but when the winds turned, the world changed. A sudden squall could shatter masts. A gale from the wrong quarter could trap ships for weeks. Sailors spoke of contrary winds as if of curses. Medieval chronicles tell of fleets stranded for months outside ports, their crews wasting away while waiting for the heavens to shift. To medieval minds, adverse winds were moral as much as natural. They were punishments or omens. A storm might mean divine displeasure. A dead calm might test patience and faith. Chronicles tell of sailors fasting, praying, or releasing birds into the sky in search of a sign. The unpredictability of wind gave rise to both fear and fascination. In the lull between tempests, sailors would listen, truly listen, to the breath of the sea. A whisper of returning breeze could fill them with ecstasy. For them, the wind was not mere air. It was the living will of the world, the science beneath the faith. Today, we understand the physics of wind, pressure gradients, thermal convection, the Coriolis effect. But for ancient navigators, knowledge was experiential, not theoretical. They didn't need to explain the wind's cause, they only needed to predict its behavior. And through careful observation, they achieved astonishing accuracy. They recorded wind patterns not in numbers but in memory. When the morning haze lingers, the sea will sleep. When the sunset burns red, the east wind is near. Each proverb was a line of data, refined through centuries of human experience. This oral science formed the backbone of navigation. It linked geography, astronomy, and meteorology into one continuous understanding. The sailor didn't separate them. He lived them as a single language, spoken by earth, air, and sea together. The navigator's breath. There is a moment on the ocean when the sails hang limp, the ropes slack, and the world holds its breath. The water lies flat as glass, the sky without motion. The sailor waits. He feels the pause in his bones. Then faintly he senses it, a whisper brushing his cheek, a change in the air's taste. He lifts his head, eyes half closed, and smiles. The wind has returned. It fills the sail like a heartbeat, steady and true. The ship stirs, the waves begin to sing again, and the world moves forward. In that instant, the sailor feels unity between himself, his vessel, and the unseen forces that surround him. He does not need a compass. He knows, as his ancestors knew, that the wind itself is enough. It always was. When the wind slept, the ocean still moved. Even on the calmest day, the sea was never still. It flowed in vast, invisible rivers beneath the surface, spiraling and streaming around the continents. Long before anyone could map them, sailors knew they existed. They felt them in the slow tug of the hull, in the tilt of the oars, in the strange resistance of water that seemed alive. These were the currents, the unseen guides of the deep, constant as time, older than any ship that dared to cross them. To modern science, they are explained by thermodynamics and planetary rotation. To ancient mariners, they were spirits, pathways, or living creatures. Yet through centuries of observation, these same mariners charted the pattern of the ocean's flow with a precision that still humbles us today. The sea that moved itself. A sailor could not see a current, but he could feel its persuasion. A boat might drift sideways even when wind and sail agreed on direction. Foam or floating debris would glide past faster than the water on it. Seaweed would move in one direction, while the wind blew in another. To the untrained, these were mysteries. To the navigator, they were information. The ancient Phoenicians, who ventured far beyond the Mediterranean into the Atlantic, were among the first to understand the great ocean's circular motion. They noticed that after days of westward travel along the African coast, the sea began to push them south and east, a slow spiral that could either imprison or release them, depending on how it was read. They learned to work with it, turning potential danger into a pathway home. Centuries later, Arab sailors on the Indian Ocean refined this knowledge into system and strategy. They named the great drift of water under the monsoon winds Kanz al-Bahr, the treasure of the sea. They knew it changed with the seasons, flowing eastward under one wind and westward under another. To sail against it was folly, to ride it was wisdom. The northern streams. In the cold reaches of the North Atlantic, Norse sailors also came to respect the sea's quiet pull. The waters that flowed between Greenland, Iceland, and Norway were not random. They were part of the Gulf Stream, though they did not call it that. The Vikings simply knew that certain lanes of water were warmer, smoother, and faster than others. Their sagas describe voyages where ships were borne by the sea's will, moving faster than oar or sail alone could carry them. They may not have known why the current flowed, but they learned its rhythm, trusting it to carry them home before the winter ice closed. Some historians believe that their awareness of this hidden stream made possible the crossing to Vinland, the North American coast, centuries before Columbus. The Indian Ocean's pulse. Nowhere, however, was the sea's heartbeat more pronounced than in the Indian Ocean. Here, the partnership of wind and current formed a living current. When the northeast monsoon blew, it drove warm water southward and westward toward Africa. When the southwest monsoon returned, the current reversed, flowing north and east. For the great maritime civilizations that ringed this ocean, Arabs, Persians, Indians, Malays, and Africans, these rhythms shaped life itself. Ports thrived or slept according to the season. Traders waited in Zanzibar, Calicut, or Muscat until the sea's pulse changed, carrying them like leaves down a mighty river. To know the current was to know time. It determined when spices, silk, and gold would move between worlds. A mistake in timing meant ruin, ships trapped in wrong winds, cargo rotting in damp holds, crews stranded for half a year. The mariner's art lay not in forcing the sea but in listening to it, learning the language of flow. The currents of the Pacific, far across the world. The Polynesians had no maps or instruments, yet they understood currents with an intimacy few could match. Their canoes, light and flexible, rode the water like living creatures. By watching how foam patterns drifted past, how seaweed clustered, and how birds fed, they could sense the presence of drift lines, vast highways of water stretching across the Pacific. These currents were more than physical forces. They were embedded in myth and story. Navigators spoke of the path of Tangaroa, the god of the sea, or of Tilolo o Timona, the running of the ocean. Their voyages followed these sacred pathways, connecting islands separated by thousands of miles. A navigator might sense a change in current by dipping his hand into the water. A cool stream meant he had entered a new band of the ocean. A warmer one, another. Subtle differences in the sea's temperature, color, and taste were clues to his position. He knew when he had reached the equatorial countercurrent, that great eastward flow between the steady westward trades, the very heartbeat of the Pacific circulation, the drift of debris and the wisdom of the sea. Even floating objects became instruments. Sailors noticed how logs, coconuts, and pumice drifted along predictable lines. Polynesian and Micronesian navigators could identify the origin of driftwood by its species, bark, and weathering, knowing which island or coast it must have come from. If such debris appeared on their beaches, it hinted at distant lands and unseen currents connecting them. In the Atlantic, Portuguese explorers centuries later used similar logic. When they discovered islands like Madeira and the Azores, they noticed that the sea delivered canes, seeds, and even carved wood from tropical lands to the west. These clues convinced them that other continents and trade routes must exist beyond the horizon. The ocean, through its drifting gifts, whispered of worlds yet unseen. The silent map. For ancient sailors, understanding currents meant understanding the sea as a living map, one that did not stay still but repeated itself in endless rhythm. They learned the places where warm water met cold, where driftwood gathered, where calm waters hinted at the meeting of opposing flows. The Mediterranean, though smaller, had its own system, a slow counterclockwise circulation, drawing water east along the African coast and returning west along the European, Phoenician, and later Roman sailors used this to their advantage, knowing when to hug a coastline or cross a gulf depending on the sea's motion. To them, the current was not an obstacle but a partner. To fight it was to waste effort. To ride with it was to move as if the world itself were carrying you. The myth of the moving sea. It is no surprise that so many myths personify the ocean's flow as a divine being. The Greeks spoke of Oceanus, a titan who encircled the earth with his eternal river. The Polynesians told of Mononoke, the great ocean, whose heartbeat never ceased. In Norse legend, the world serpent Jörmungandr coiled beneath the sea, its body shifting the tides. These were not naive fantasies. They were metaphors for real observation. To sailors who had felt the slow power of currents, the sea truly seemed alive, conscious, purposeful. It was not chaos, but pattern. Mysterious, yes, but never random. The modern rediscovery. When European explorers of the Age of Discovery crossed the oceans with compasses and charts, they believed themselves to be discovering new truths. Yet many of their routes, the trade winds, the equatorial drift, the gyres, had already been known in practice, if not in theory, to earlier navigators. The Portuguese discovered the Volta do Mar, the turn of the sea, a circular current system in the Atlantic that carried ships westward along Africa, and then homeward north and east toward Europe. But this discovery was in truth a rediscovery of what the ocean had whispered to mariners for millennia, that the sea moves in great circles, and those who listen move fastest. The navigator's drift. Picture a medieval sailor standing on the deck at dawn, his ship rocking gently. The wind is still, but the water moves, a slow, silent force carrying him northward. He leans on the rail, watching foam slide past the hull, feeling the pulse of the sea beneath his feet. He cannot see the path, yet he knows it exists. He adjusts the rudder slightly, not to fight the current, but to accompany it. The ship begins to glide more smoothly, its rhythm aligned with the ocean's secret motion. He smiles, for he understands a truth older than any compass, that to navigate the sea is not to command it, but to surrender intelligently, gracefully, to its hidden flow. The world beneath him moves, eternal and unseen, and he, for this brief passage across its surface, moves with it. When the night descended upon the sea, it did not bring blindness. It brought a map, vast, silent, and eternal. Above the rolling darkness, the heavens unfolded their cold fire, a tapestry of light through which every true navigator could read the way home. Long before iron needles floated in bowls of water, the stars were the first compass humanity ever knew. The sky as a mirror of the earth. To those who lived beneath the open sky, shepherds, fishermen, desert travelers, and mariners, the stars were not distant suns. They were living markers, placed with purpose. The heavens rotated with clockwork precision. Constellations rose and set with the rhythm of the year. A sailor who learned that rhythm could find his direction, even on the emptiest horizon. The ancients saw the sky as a reflection of the world below. In Egypt, the Nile's flooding coincided with the rising of Sirius, the dog star. In Mesopotamia, priests watched the heavens to predict seasons and time. And when humankind finally took to the sea, those same stars became anchors of certainty in an uncertain element. The pole star, the fixed point. In the northern hemisphere, one star ruled above all, Polaris, the North Star. It did not rise or set. It hung steady in the sky, unmoving, while all others wheeled about. To a sailor adrift in the North Atlantic, Polaris was salvation. Its height above the horizon told him his latitude, how far north or south he was. The higher the star, the nearer to the Arctic. The lower, the closer to the equator. Norsemen crossing to Iceland and Greenland learned to judge its angle by the breadth of a hand held to the horizon. Later, Arab and Mediterranean navigators measured it with the camel, a simple wooden card, and strings centuries before sextants existed. A sailor might not know the mathematics, but his body remembered the angle, his eyes the pattern. If the North Star shifted higher than the mast's top, he knew he had drifted north. If it sank toward the waves, he had gone too far south. It was navigation by feeling, by memory, by intimacy with the sky. The southern problem. But in the southern hemisphere, the pole star disappeared. Here, the heavens turned without a fixed beacon. Yet the southern navigators, from Arab traders to Polynesian voyagers, devised other guides. They learned to read the Southern Cross, and from its long arm they imagined an invisible point in the void, the South Celestial Pole. To find it, they extended the cross's axis downward through the darkness, marking where it would touch the horizon. That invisible point, though no star marked it, became the mirror of Polaris, the still heart of the southern sky. The path of Orion, and the eternal compass. Every culture found its own constellations, but many agreed on Orion, the hunter striding across the heavens. His belt of 3 bright stars pointed east and west with remarkable accuracy. To sailors on the equator, Orion rose and set upright, like a celestial clockwork. To those farther north were soft. His tilt revealed their latitude. The Egyptians saw Orion as Osiris, god of rebirth, the Greeks as the great hunter, the Pacific Islanders as the spine of the sky. But for all, he was a compass of the cosmos. When his sword dipped below the horizon, dawn approached. When his shoulder brushed the zenith, the year turned. The mariners of the desert and the sea, Arab navigators, whose caravans once crossed sand before they sailed across water, brought to the ocean a deep knowledge of stars. They memorized dozens of constellations and the bearings of their rising and setting. Their Qibla charts showed which stars pointed to Mecca, but they also served at sea to mark the cardinal directions. They divided the sky into 28 Manazil al-Qamar, lunar mansions, through which the moon passed each month. By noting which mansion the moon occupied, they could tell both time and season. Their observations, precise and poetic, became the foundation of later astronomical navigation. They taught that the sea has 2 faces, one below, one above. The waves and the stars mirrored each other, both flowing with hidden rhythm. The Polynesian star paths, half a world away, in the open Pacific, the Polynesians developed one of the most astonishing systems of celestial navigation ever known, and did so entirely without written language or instruments. Their wayfinders memorized the rising and setting positions of hundreds of stars, known collectively as the star compass. To them, the horizon was a circle divided into 32 or more named houses. Each star rose from one house and set in another. A navigator could steer his canoe by keeping a chosen star at a constant height above the prow. As that star sank, another from the same path rose to replace it, forming a chain of guidance across the night. If clouds obscured the sky, they turned to the swell of the sea, the flight of birds, or the glow of distant islands reflected in the clouds. They could even feel subtle differences in wave direction beneath the hull, reading the ocean as if it were an extension of the heavens. The silent teachers. The sea was never silent, and neither were the stars. They whispered lessons to those who watched long enough. A sailor learned that bright stars close to the horizon twinkled fiercely, distorted by moisture and air, but high stars burned steady and pure. He learned that constellations shifted with the seasons, and that some stars vanished for months, returning at predictable times. This repetition became a calendar. The rising of certain constellations signaled harvests, migrations, and the time to launch voyages. To the Greeks, the reappearance of the Pleiades meant the start of the sailing season. To the Maori, it was Matariki, the new year. Across cultures, the heavens kept the same rhythm, only sung in different tongues. Star lore and faith. For medieval sailors, religion and navigation intertwined. To invoke the stars was not purely scientific, it was spiritual. They prayed to the Virgin as Stella Maris, the star of the sea. Her name adorned countless ships, for she was both guide and protector. The sky was the domain of angels, and to follow it was to move under divine order. Even the most practical mariner, tracing the North Star with his calloused finger, felt he was aligning not just his ship, but his soul, to a cosmic harmony. When clouds covered the sky, but what of nights when the stars hid? What of the endless gray that blanketed the medieval mariner's world for days? In those moments, he turned to memory and rhythm. He counted the beat of waves, the pull of the rudder, the creak of the ropes, all to estimate how far he had drifted since the last clear sighting. The best navigators were those who remembered the stars even when they were gone. Their minds carried a map of the heavens so vivid they could see it through the fog. The dawn's promise. Then came dawn. The stars faded, but not before offering one final gift, the morning star, Venus, blazing low in the east. It was both an omen and a clock, marking the approach of day. Mariners named it Phosphorus, the light bringer, or Lucifer, the morning herald. When it vanished in the brightening sky, the navigator lowered his gaze from heaven back to earth, or rather to sea, and began his day's watch anew. In that turning from starlight to sunlight lay the rhythm of an ancient truth, that navigation was never about mastery, but about relationship, a conversation between human patience and celestial order. The compass, when it came, would change the world, but for millennia before it, the world had already been charted in the silent fire above. There were no engines, no propellers, no certainty. The medieval sailor lived and died by the wind. To understand its moods was to survive, to misread them was to vanish. Before the compass, even before reliable charts, the air itself became the mariner's most trusted messenger. It was not merely a force, it was a language, a living presence that could be read, smelled, and heard. The breath of the world. Every sea had its personality, and each wind carried a name. In the Mediterranean, they called them the eternal winds, 8 directions personified as gods, later carved on marble towers and drawn on wind roses long before magnetic north was known. Boreas came cold from the north, Notus warm from the south, Zephyrus soft from the west, Eurus sharp from the east. The Greeks charted them, the Romans borrowed them, and the sailors of the Middle Ages prayed to them. A change in wind was a change in fate. A steady west wind meant prosperity. A sudden gust from the east could mean wreckage. Experienced sailors felt it in their skin, the taste of salt on the air, the dryness of a coming sirocco, the metallic scent that preceded a storm. When the great Arab and Indian navigators of the Indian Ocean learned to predict the monsoon, they were not using instruments, but memory. The monsoon was not a single wind, but the breath of the world itself, changing direction with the sun. To miss its shift by a few days could strand a fleet for months. The 12 winds and the first wind rose. Long before the compass needle was trusted, sailors drew wind roses, circles divided by the known directions of the winds. These were not magnetic bearings, but climatic ones, a blending of geography, experience, and mythology. In the 13th century, before the compass was common, Mediterranean pilots used 12 or 16 winds to describe their routes. A captain would say, "We sail to winds toward Zephyrus," meaning a certain slant westward, not a fixed angle. Each wind represented not an abstract direction, but a known path through water, a lane of currents and weather. From this practical system, later cartographers drew the first charts with radiating lines, the ancestors of the compass rose. But at sea, the sailor still watched the heavens and the surface of the water, not ink and parchment, clouds, smells, and the voice of distance. A mariner's world was a tapestry of subtle signs. Before dawn, he studied the color of clouds. A dull gray foretold steady wind, streaks of crimson meant turbulence. High, fast-moving clouds indicated a change of direction. The smell of ozone and the trembling of ropes foretold a squall. The air had textures, warm, cool, dry, or heavy. The Mediterranean sailor could tell from humidity whether the wind came from the Sahara or the Alps. The Polynesian wayfinder smelled land hours before it was visible. The scent of flowers, of soil, of fires carried out over the sea. Sound, too, was a navigator's ally. The wind changed its voice before it changed its force. A whisper became a whistle, then a scream. The rigging hummed differently in each breeze, and the practiced ear of a helmsman could hear when the ship began to slip off course. The monsoon's dance. In the Indian Ocean, the seasonal winds were both predictable and sacred. The northeast monsoon brought dry air and favorable westward sailing from December to March. Then the southwest monsoon returned, wet and fierce, carrying ships back east from Africa to India and beyond. This rhythm shaped centuries of trade. Arab merchants in Oman, Persian navigators, Indian traders from Calicut, all waited in port for the correct wind. When it came, fleets departed together, each vessel trusting the invisible path of air across thousands of miles. Sailors gave the monsoon names and personalities. Kaki, the whispering Masim, the season. The very word monsoon comes from the Arabic Masim, meaning appointed time. It was not chaos, but divine order, the breath of the Creator turning the wheel of the world. The Northmen and the storms. Far to the north, where the seas were colder and harsher, the Vikings learned to live with different winds, more violent, more sudden. The North Atlantic had no gentle monsoon, only the unpredictable dance of polar air and storm. Yet even there, patterns emerged. The Norse sagas speak of the Landvertir, the land spirits that controlled wind and wave. When they set sail for Greenland or Vinland, the captains sought signs in seabirds, in the shape of clouds over distant ice, in the smell of the wind that came off glaciers. They might have prayed to Odin or Njord, but beneath the prayer lay observation, centuries of sensory memory woven into superstition. They knew that a southerly breeze brought fog, that the sharp, dry wind from the northeast foretold clear skies but bitter cold, that the west wind, when warm, meant the approach of land. The Mediterranean's eternal breath. The medieval Mediterranean was a mosaic of winds. Sailors knew the Tramontane from the mountains, the Sirocco from the Sahara, the Mistral that tore through the Rhine Valley. Each port had its own lore. In Genoa, they said the Mistral cleaned the sky so well that even the stars seemed sharper. In Venice, the Bora could flatten ships in harbor within minutes. A pilot could name a dozen winds in a single day's sail. The pattern of their rotation through the seasons was so consistent that routes were planned around them. The Genoese called their route to Crete the way of Zephyrus. The return, when the wind turned, was the way of Boreas. Even prayers reflected this reality. Domini dirige ventos, the sailors chanted, Lord, direct the winds, listening to the sea's skin. A ship's master did not only watch the air, he watched the water that mirrored it. A calm, glossy sea foretold a change of wind. Rippled waves meant a steady breeze. Foam lines showed direction. The way the swell crossed the bow told of currents shifting beneath the surface. In the equatorial Atlantic, Portuguese sailors learned to read the horse latitudes, the still, suffocating regions where the wind could vanish for days. To cross them, they studied faint tremors on the surface that betrayed air moving high above. A trained navigator could set his sails for a wind he could not yet feel. The birds, the light, and the invisible signs. Not all signs came from the air itself. Birds became living barometers. When they flew low and restless, wind was coming. When they soared high, calm endured. Light, too, carried clues. A pale greenish hue at sunset warned of moisture, a coming gale. Some sailors claimed to see faint glowing halos around their masts on stormy nights. St. Elmo's fire, an eerie blue light caused by static electricity. To many, it was the spirit of the saint protecting them. To others, it meant a storm at hand. The unwritten science. Though medieval sailors lacked instruments, they possessed a body of empirical knowledge that, in hindsight, was almost scientific. Each voyage added to the communal memory of wind and season. Apprentices learned not from books, but from nights on deck, from the whispered instructions of older men. Feel the breath, an old helmsman might say. If it smells of iron, strike the sail. If it smells of honey, set it wide. They named and remembered, and in that act of remembering built an unwritten meteorology of the sea, the compass within. When at last a magnetic compass came, it did not replace this wisdom. It merely added a new layer. The true mariner still listened to the wind, still looked to the sky. The compass pointed north, but it did not tell of storms, of stillness, or of favor. Only the senses could do that. And even now, centuries later, a sailor standing alone on deck at dawn feels what his ancestors felt, the breath of the planet moving across his face, the low hum of ropes, the promise of direction carried in air. Before the compass, men did not command the wind, they conversed with it. Theirs was not navigation through domination, but through dialogue, while listening to the oldest voice the earth still speaks. Long before charts mapped the oceans, Before sextants gleamed or compasses whispered of magnetic north, the sea itself served as a map, shifting, living, but legible to those who learned its language. To the medieval sailor, every wave, every color of water, every glimmer of foam held meaning. The ocean was not blank. It was a living geography, filled with what one navigator called floating landmarks. The color of direction. To the modern eye, the sea seems one unbroken blue, but to ancient mariners, its hues were a spectrum of knowledge. In the Mediterranean, a dark, indigo water told of depth far from shore, far from safety. A lighter, greenish tone meant shallows, the approach of land or reefs. In tropical waters, turquoise betrayed coral beneath. The Arabs of the Red Sea knew the difference between Bahr Amor, the Red Sea, and Bahr Ektor, the Green Sea, names that referred not only to the regions, but to the colors that reflected the seabed and the plankton below. They could tell by sight alone when they approached sandbanks or the mouths of rivers. The Norsemen, too, learned to trust color. In the North Atlantic, the meeting of cold Arctic water with the warmer Gulf Stream created streaks of milky green foam. These lines marked fishing grounds, but they also served as waypoints. A helmsman might steer where the gray sea meets the green, knowing it would lead him toward Iceland. The swell's secret directions. Beneath the visible waves, larger patterns moved along slow swells that rolled across entire oceans. These were the pulse of the sea, the memory of distant winds. The Polynesians called them kahalo, and they read them with astonishing precision. A wayfinder could stand in a canoe and feel, through the soles of his feet, the crossing of two swells, one from the prevailing trade winds, another rebounding from a distant island. From that intersection, he knew where land must lie, even when it was hundreds of miles away. To him, the sea was not chaos. It was a woven fabric of motion, and every thread pointed somewhere. He could feel the direction of the swell change as he passed from deep to shallow waters, from open sea to atoll. This was navigation not by sight, but by the body itself, the drift and the debris. Every ocean had its flotsam, logs, reeds, seaweed, feathers, and each piece carried a message. The Vikings, watching driftwood along the Norwegian coast, learned to predict the direction of prevailing currents. They even distinguished between woods from Greenland, Iceland, or Russia by their bark. Polynesians examined floating coconuts and seeds, knowing which islands they came from. Drift patterns told them the hidden geography of the Pacific, an invisible map traced by the wandering gifts of the sea. The medieval Portuguese, centuries later, would rediscover this wisdom. When they reached the Azores, they noticed strange wood and fruits washing ashore from the west, signs that another landmass, unknown and immense, must exist beyond the horizon. Those silent clues would one day inspire voyages across the Atlantic. The shape of the sea's skin. A seasoned mariner could read the texture of the water. A calm, oily surface meant air pressure changing, the prelude to storm. Choppy, and even ripples foretold crosswinds. The direction of foam streaks revealed the wind's true course better than a flag ever could. At night, when even the stars hid, sailors relied on the sea's skin for orientation. The glow of phosphorescence, plankton shining with every movement, showed the wake of the ship and its steadiness. Some said the sea's glow formed patterns are on land, shimmering differently where shallow reefs broke the water's calm. The creatures as guides. Animals, too, were part of the navigator's alphabet. Flocks of seabirds hinted at islands nearby. Tuna and flying fish followed certain currents. Whales migrated along invisible highways that matched the ocean's gyres. In the Indian Ocean, sailors spoke of the fish winds, so called because certain breezes brought schools of fish to the surface. When gulls began to circle, it was time to cast nets, but also a sign that the coastline was near, for birds rarely strayed far from nesting ground. The Vikings followed whales and seabirds to find new lands. The Polynesians read the flights of the Manuoku white tern, which always returned to land at night. To see one flying high at sunset was to know an island lay within 100 miles. The The voices beneath, sound carried over the sea in strange ways. On still nights, the creaking of a distant ship could be heard miles away. Some sailors claimed they could hear the crashing of waves on unseen shores before sighting them, a low thunder beneath the wind. The Polynesians called this phenomenon penio, the sound of teeth, meaning the sea biting the land. To those who listened carefully, it was the voice of destination itself, the smell of home. Smell, too, was a compass. Arab sailors could tell they were nearing Yemen when the air filled with the fragrance of frankincense carried up by the wind. Polynesians could scent land hours before sighting it, the sweetness of flowers, the musk of damp soil. In the North Sea, medieval fishermen knew they approached shore when the smell of peat fires drifted over the waves. To them, it was the smell of salvation, the land that floated. To early mariners, islands seemed to move. The sea changed around them, colors shifting, currents bending, the angle of stars different from one side to another. Some sailors believed the islands themselves drifted, alive and restless. In their stories, the ocean's face was dotted with wandering lands that appeared and vanished. These tales, though mythical, often arose from real experience. Fog banks, mirages, and optical illusions caused by temperature layers. The so-called floating islands were phenomena of light, but also metaphors for how unstable the sea's geography could seem without instruments. The memory of passage. Every sailor carried a mental chart of signs. He remembered where the sea turned from gray to green, where birds gathered, where the smell of kelp thickened. He did not record these in ink, but in body and story. An old pilot might teach his apprentice. When the swell strikes from the right and the foam turns silver, steer half a hand toward the sunrise. These oral maps, passed from generation to generation, were the backbone of pre-compass navigation. They transformed the ocean from void into landscape, not static, but familiar. The sea as teacher. To read the sea was to accept its authority. Every voyage began with humility, for the sailor entered a world that could not be mastered, only interpreted. The best navigators were those who never stopped observing. Each dawn, they looked at the horizon as if it were the first time. Each night, they listened to the waves as if they might speak a new truth. The sea, after all, was a living manuscript, rewritten each hour by wind, tide, and moon. In time, compasses, maps, and instruments would replace these arts. But the knowledge did not die. Even today, when sailors cross vast oceans with satellites above them, they still glance at the waves, feel the swell beneath, smell the change in air. Somewhere deep within them, the memory of those early mariners endures, the ones who learned that the world could be read not only by eye, but by every sense. They did not need a compass to find their way. The compass was inside them, carved by patience, honed by wind, and written in the rhythm of the sea itself. Before the compass needle spun its quiet magic, the sky was a canvas of clues, a realm of signs, both subtle and grand, that medieval sailors learned to interpret as faithfully as scripture. The heavens were not just above them. They were around them, shaping every decision, whispering of both danger and direction. To the sea traveler, the sky was a living chart, where each cloud, color, and gust of wind told a story. The sun is the eternal guide. The sun was the most ancient compass. Every dawn, sailors watched where it rose, marking east. Every dusk, they followed it down to find west. But they did not merely note its position. They studied its path. In the Mediterranean, where voyages hugged the coastlines, captains taught their apprentices to watch the angle of sunrise in different seasons. The summer sun rose further north, the winter sun further south. By remembering these arcs, they could sense their approximate latitude, even without tools. In northern seas, where clouds often veiled the sun, the Vikings developed a remarkable aid, the sunstone. This crystal, likely Iceland's spar, polarized light, allowing sailors to detect the hidden sun's direction through thick fog or twilight. When held up to the sky, the stone glowed brightest when pointed toward the invisible sun. It was both science and sorcery, a secret weapon of the north. The clock of the shadows, Sailors also read time and direction through shadows. A stick, a finger, even the ship's mast could serve as a sundial. By marking how shadows shifted, a helmsman could confirm his bearing or estimate the hour. But this art was more than geometry. It was rhythm. The same sailor who watched shadows by day would watch stars by night, forming a seamless understanding of the sky's clockwork. His life moved not by bells or gears, but by light and darkness. The Arabs refined this further. Their scholars, blending navigation with astronomy, charted solar arcs and declinations. They could find Qibla, the direction of Mecca, anywhere on earth, a spiritual navigation that mirrored the mariner's earthly one. Clouds as messengers. The medieval mariner knew clouds not as scenery but as omens. Wisps of cirrus, high and feathered, warned of distant storms. Puffy cumulus meant fair weather, but when they grew towers, it was time to reef the sails. In the tropics, Polynesian voyagers could read the shapes of clouds to locate islands. Certain formations, called apua, gathered over land due to the heat rising from forests or mountains. Even if the island itself lay hidden below the horizon, its cloud halo gave it away. In the North Atlantic, Vikings read the low sea smoke, mist that rose when cold air met warmer water. It told them of shifting winds and ice nearby. The combination of color and motion could mean the difference between safe passage and disaster. The colors of the sky. At dawn and dusk, the medieval sailor saw not beauty but prophecy. A red sunrise warned. Sailor, take warning, a red sunset promised. Sailor's delight. This ancient saying, still known today, had scientific truth. A red evening sky meant dust and dry air in the west, stable weather approaching. A red dawn, however, reflected moisture and storms moving in from the east. But in medieval times, these were not meteorological theories. They were living rules. To a seafarer, the world spoke in colors, and red was the language of fate. Some chroniclers recorded even stranger lore. If the clouds glowed greenish after sunset, it foretold fierce storms. If the horizon shimmered white, fog and calm would trap ships for days. The breath of the wind, the wind, unseen but ever present, was both enemy and friend. To understand it was to command the sea. The ancient Greeks named their winds as gods: Boreas north, Zephyrus west, Notus south, and Eurus east. These names persisted into the Middle Ages, painted onto early wind roses long before the compass's needle joined them. Every port and culture developed its own rose of winds. The Mediterranean mariners used 12 classical winds. The Arabs of the Red Sea named theirs after trade routes: Al-Shamal, the north wind, and Al-Janab, the south. The Polynesians had entire songs describing winds, each with a distinct tone, smell, and temperature. To medieval sailors, the wind's voice told its nature. A steady hum meant safety. A whistle through the rigging warned of change. The wind scent of salt, sand, or vegetation told whether land was near or open ocean awaited. They watched how it rippled the sails, how it carried foam across the sea's surface. The wind was their invisible mapmaker, shaping routes long before compass bearings existed. Reading the horizon. A clear horizon was a sailor's best friend, but few horizons stayed clear for long. By studying the way clouds gathered or dissolved at its edge, navigators could forecast weather with surprising accuracy. When a low, black line appeared on the southern horizon, mariners in the Indian Ocean would cry monsoon, for they knew the season had turned. When the horizon shimmered in heat, they prepared for calms. When it sharpened with cold, a gale was near. To the untrained eye, these were mere shades and distances. To a sailor, they were the voice of the world itself, the whispers of birds and air. The sky was also filled with living signs. Birds flew in certain directions before storms, or high and fast before fair weather. Swallows skimming low over the waves meant moisture and rain coming soon. Gulls gathering in flocks signaled fish, but also winds shifting toward shore. Even the air's feel mattered. Experienced helmsmen could sense the pressure drop before a storm, not with instruments, but in their bones an ache in the joints, a heaviness behind the eyes. To them, the sky was not distant but intimate, the cycle of trust. To sail by the sky required faith, not blind faith, but a trust earned through repetition and memory. Each voyage reinforced patterns, the way the sun rose over certain islands, the cloud banks that always formed beyond a cape, the steady winds that returned each season. Medieval sailors did not separate science from superstition. Both were parts of the same truth. The heavens were divine, and to study them was to glimpse the order of creation. The sea tested that belief every day. The language of the sky. By the time compasses became common in Europe, around the 13th century, sky reading was already a refined art. Manuals for pilots described how to combine celestial, solar, and wind observations to steer across oceans. But for many, the old methods never faded. Even as magnetic needles turned inside boxes, captains still looked to the sun and sky first, not because they distrusted instruments, but because they trusted the world itself. To a medieval mariner, navigation was not about controlling nature. It was about listening to it. The sky spoke constantly, but only to those who had learned its grammar, a grammar of clouds and color, of warmth and wind, of silence and song. The sky and the soul. In the end, sky and sea reflected each other, one above, one below. A sailor who watched both understood balance. The horizon was the line where heaven kissed earth, and every voyage crossed it again and again. When a medieval pilot stood on deck at twilight, watching the sun dip below that perfect line, he was not only measuring direction, he was witnessing eternity, the turning of the world, the rhythm of time itself. He did not have a compass. He had the sky, a vast, faithful, and full of secrets. And to him, that was enough. To the medieval sailor, the sea was not still. Even on the calmest days, when wind fell silent and sails hung loose, something moved beneath. The water breathed, slow, invisible, but steady, a heartbeat of the world that could carry ships for weeks or dash them to ruin. These were the currents and tides, the secret rivers of the sea. Long before modern charts named the Gulf Stream or mapped the monsoon, sailors had learned to feel them, read them, and sometimes fear them. The unseen roads beneath. Every ocean hides its own roads. Long before men knew of the Earth's rotation or the moon's pull, they sensed that the sea had paths. A captain who ignored them drifted astray. One who mastered them could travel farther than any beforehand. The Arab navigators of the Indian Ocean, among the first true oceanic sailors, called these roads Bar al-Mijra, the moving seas. They charted them not with instruments, but with memory. How long it took for a floating palm trunk to vanish, how far a ship drifted overnight, how the foam bent when the wind was still. To them, each current had a personality, some gentle and steady, others treacherous and circular. They understood the seasonal rhythm of the monsoon winds, which reversed each year, and with them the ocean's flow. By synchronizing their voyages with these invisible rivers, they could cross thousands of miles between East Africa, Arabia, and India long before the compass reached Europe. The northern rivers of ice. In the cold North Atlantic, the Vikings discovered another great current. Though they could not name it, they knew its power. The Gulf Stream, that warm, swift river of water running from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic, shaped every voyage westward. The Vikings called it the Road of the Whales. They followed its warmer waters and abundant fish to Iceland, then Greenland, and perhaps even to Vinland, North America. They noticed that driftwood from western lands followed this same path eastward, washing onto Norwegian shores. When fog fell thick or stars disappeared, they knew the current would carry them northward along Greenland's coast if they held steady. In this way, the sea itself became their unspoken guide, a force that both hindered and helped, depending on whether they understood its flow. The tides as the moon's voice. Every coastal sailor knew the moon commanded the tides. Even before they understood the mechanism, they felt the pattern, the twice-daily rise and fall, the slack waters in between, the sudden rush of flood and ebb. In Britain and France, where tidal ranges could reach 10 meters, knowing the tides was the difference between life and death. Ships could be trapped on sandbanks or smashed against cliffs if they misjudged the moon. Pilots memorized tide tables not as numbers, but as stories. When the new moon wakes, the river grows hungry. When the old moon sleeps, the sea breathes out. In northern ports, sailors read the tides by sound. The pitch of waves against the rocks told them whether the sea was rising or falling. At night, they might touch the ropes of the harbor and feel the tension, tighter when the tide climbed, looser when it ebbed. In the east, the Chinese perfected the art. They noted how the tide came earlier when the moon stood high and later when it waned. By the 11th century, they used tide charts to plan journeys through the treacherous estuaries of the Yangtze, the currents of the wind. Not all movement below came from the deep. Much was born of air above. Wind drove surface currents, and sailors quickly learned to see the link. The monsoons were the most famous, vast seasonal winds that reversed direction between summer and winter, shaping trade across the Indian Ocean. When the monsoon blew from the southwest, ships could sail from Africa to India. When it reversed, they could return home. The Arabs and Indians built their entire maritime calendar around these breadths of the world. In medieval Europe, sailors in the Bay of Biscay and the English Channel recognized local analogues: steady summer drifts northward, winter surges southward. These were not random. They were the breath of the earth translated into motion of water. Some called them wind tides, and learned that if the wind persisted long enough in one direction, it could pile the sea higher on one coast than another. Fishermen who watched how the currents bent the weed or carried the foam could anticipate changes days ahead of any storm. The whirlpools of legend. No medieval tale of the sea was complete without the dreaded whirlpool, the maelstrom that could swallow ships whole. While many of these were exaggerated myths, some were rooted in real tidal phenomena. Off the coast of Norway, between the Lofoten Islands, lies the Moskenstraumen, a true maelstrom where powerful tidal currents collide. Medieval sailors spoke of it in hushed tones, believing it was a gateway to the underworld. The sea roared there like thunder, and the foam spiraled in vast white funnels. To the uninitiated, such forces seemed supernatural, but to skilled pilots, they were simply another rhythm to respect. They learned to time their crossings, to read the eddies, to slip past when the sea's breath paused. The drift of discovery. Currents carried more than water. They carried knowledge. A sailor who saw strange fruits or carved wood floating in the waves knew that land must exist beyond the horizon. This is how, in the 15th century, Portuguese navigators guessed at the existence of Brazil before setting eyes on it. Centuries earlier, Polynesians had mastered the same art. They observed how certain drift patterns carried seeds from one island to another, how birds followed specific eddies, how floating debris circled back after months. These were the first oceanographic maps, stored not on parchment but in memory. The Polynesian stick charts that survive today, fragile frames of palm fibers and shells, represent this ancient wisdom. Each curved rod stands for a swell or current, each shell an island. To the untrained eye it seems abstract, but to a navigator it is as precise as any compass rose. The voices in the deep. There were sailors who swore that the sea itself spoke when the tides turned. The groaning of ships' hulls, the low hum beneath the keel, these were not tricks of imagination, but the resonance of moving water. To the medieval ear, these sounds became omens. When the tide murmured gently, they believed the sea was at peace. When it throbbed with deep tones, they feared a storm or whirlpool forming. Though superstition colored their beliefs, experience often confirmed them. Sound does travel differently depending on current and pressure. A sailor who spent years at sea learned to sense those changes instinctively. The science hidden in superstition. Modern oceanography would later reveal the truth behind these old arts. The moon's gravity pulling tides, Earth's spin bending currents into jars, heat and salt creating deep flows. But long before science gave them names, Medieval mariners knew their presence. They did not need equations to understand the world's balance. They watched, remembered, and adapted. Their superstition was not ignorance. It was early observation wrapped in myth. The rhythm of the sea. To live by the tides was to live by rhythm. Sailors planned their lives around the moon, traders around the monsoon, and fishermen around the flood. The sea was both calendar and clock, its pulse marking the passage of time more faithfully than any bell or hourglass. A sailor could leave port at new moon, knowing that by full moon he would be home again, the tides themselves carrying him there. When the compass finally came, it did not replace these rhythms, it only refined them. The old art of reading the sea's currents, of feeling its silent pull, continued for centuries. Even today, a seasoned mariner checks the tide tables not as ritual, but as reverence. The sea, after all, is not chaos. It moves with purpose, with laws older than any chart. The medieval sailor did not command it, he joined it, becoming part of its current, a brief flicker in its endless flow. And in that surrender, he found direction. Before the familiar needle came to rest upon its pivot, pointing ever north, there were centuries of groping in the dark, of rumor, experiment, and wonder. The compass, as we think of it, was not born in an instant. It emerged slowly from myth and metal, from the strange power of a stone that seemed alive. For the medieval sailor, that power was half miracle, half mystery, the stone that knew north. Long before ships bore compasses, miners and smiths had found a curious ore, magnetite. When touched to iron, it gave the metal a faint will of its own, a desire to point, to align, to follow unseen forces. The Greeks called it the Herculean stone. The Chinese named it Qixi, the loving stone, for it seemed to love iron and draw it close. By the 11th century, Chinese seafarers had already discovered that a magnetized needle, floated on water or hung from silk, always turned toward a fixed direction. They called it the soft-pointing spoon. Early records describe fortune-tellers using it first, and sailors borrowing the idea later. In the Arab world, travelers spoke of the stone that points the way. Traders along the Silk Road carried stories of Chinese junks crossing fog-shrouded seas, guided not by stars but by this invisible force. By the late 12th century, word reached Europe, first Sicily, then England, through the hands of crusaders, merchants, and scholars. And so began the Western fascination with a device that promised certainty in a world of shifting waves. The first floating needles. The earliest European compasses were fragile things, little more than a sewing needle rubbed against a lodestone, then placed on a sliver of reed floating in a bowl of water. Sailors called it a mariner's compass, but to many it seemed a relic of sorcery. Italian chroniclers wrote of Amalfi sailors carrying the dancing needle on voyages. English monk Alexander Neckham mentioned it around 1187, marveling that the sailor, even when the heavens are hidden, can still steer his ship. At first, the instrument was used secretly, a trick of pilots who did not wish to share their knowledge. To the uninitiated, it seemed witchcraft, a bit of iron that moved without wind, that knew direction even when the sun was gone. Suspicion and faith. The church viewed the early compass with deep suspicion. How could an inanimate object know where north lay? Priests warned that such power might come from the devil. Some ports even banned its use, fearing divine punishment for trespassing on God's domain. For navigation, they said, was meant to depend on faith and the stars, not on man's devices. Yet others saw in the compass a proof of divine order, that God had inscribed harmony even in stone and iron, aligning all things toward heaven's pole. Pilgrims heading east began to carry small magnetic needles, blessing them before departure. By the 13th century, the compass had become less feared and more revered. The hand of God, some said, guiding sailors through chaos. The rose of winds. Once the needle was trusted, sailors needed a way to read it. So was born the wind rose, the forerunner of the compass card. Its circle divided the horizon into known winds, each with a name: Tramontana north, Greco northeast, Levante east, Sirocco southeast, and so on, 12 or sometimes 16 in all. These names came not from mathematics, but from experience, from how the winds felt and smelled. The Tramontana was cold and dry, blowing down from the mountains. The Sirocco was hot and damp, smelling of sand from Africa. When the compass needle was mounted above this circle, it pointed toward the spirit of each wind. Navigation became poetry. Sail to points into the breath of Levante, captains would say, or turn your prow to the song of Mistral. The box of wonder. By the late 13th century, shipbuilders began enclosing the needle in a box to keep it steady at sea. The dry compass, a needle fixed to a card and mounted on a pivot, replaced the fragile floating kind. In Genoa, Venice, and Lisbon, craftsmen built compass boxes of polished wood and brass. They suspended the whole apparatus on gimbals, so that would stay level as the ship rolled. Now, at last, the compass could be used in rough seas, not only in calm harbors. On the lid of each box, artisans carved a cross or star to mark north, both a symbol of faith and a warning never to lose one's way. The magnetic worldview. The compass changed more than navigation. It changed thought itself. Before it, direction was relative. Toward the sunrise, away from the wind, past the headland. With the compass, the world gained fixed points. Maps began to align with north at the top. Pilots started recording bearings, north by east, west southwest. Space itself became measurable, universal, shared. Scholars puzzled over the mystery of magnetism. Some believed the earth contained a giant lodestone at its heart. Others thought the stars pulled the needle. A few mystics claimed it saw heaven itself. Roger Bacon, the English friar, called it a miracle of nature, foreseeing that it would open the world to discovery. He was right, between art and instinct. Still, the compass was never enough on its own. Medieval sailors trusted it but never fully surrendered to it. A true helmsman combined it with the old ways, reading the stars, the swell, the color of the sea. Many captains warned their crews. The needle knows north, not home. For storms could twist a ship far from course. Currents could drift her miles aside. The compass gave direction, but not position. It was a voice, not a map. Thus the art of the sea remained a blend of science and feeling, of steel and soul. The compass and the cross. On every voyage, before leaving port, sailors gathered around the compass. They prayed not only for fair winds, but for their instrument to stay true. They believed that storms could bewitch the needle, or that lightning could make it mad. Some captains drew holy symbols near the card. Others wrapped the lodestone in cloth marked with psalms. In northern waters, Norsemen inscribed runes of protection. In the Mediterranean, the Virgin's image was painted on the compass lid. For though the compass revealed the world's order, the sea still remained wild. The needle could point the way, but only courage could follow it. The quiet revolution. By the 14th century, the compass had spread across Europe. Genoa's ships carried it to England. Hanseatic merchants used it in the Baltic. Portuguese explorers refined it for the open Atlantic. It did not shout its importance. It changed the world quietly. With every voyage made possible by its guidance, the known world grew larger, the maps more detailed, the horizons wider. It turned sailors into navigators, wanderers into explorers, and oceans into bridges. The invisible north. And yet, even as compasses multiplied, no one could explain why the needle pointed north. For centuries, it remained a mystery, a whisper of the earth's hidden spirit. Some said the magnetic north was a mountain of iron at the top of the world. Others imagined a celestial pillar on which the heavens revolved. The compass, they thought, was drawn to it by divine magnetism. It was not until the age of science that the truth would come. The earth itself is a great magnet, but to the medieval mind, that revelation would have been no less wondrous than God's own touch. The compass, born from a stone that loved iron, did more than guide ships. It reoriented humanity's sense of place. It taught us that direction could be constant even in a shifting world, that amid chaos, there was always a north. and though its needle trembled with every wave, it always found its way home. Long before compasses became common, and long after they did, the true masters of navigation were not kings or scholars but the pilots, those quiet men whose minds held the sea like a living chart. They were not explorers in the modern sense. They were guardians of knowledge, walking libraries of coasts, winds, and currents. Their world was one of murmured instructions and inherited secrets, passed from father to son, from master to apprentice, in salt-stained words rather than ink and parchment. The living charts. A pilot in the 12th or 13th century did not read a map. He was the map. Every inlet, shoal, tide, and landmark lived in his memory. He could close his eyes and trace an invisible route across the water, naming the feel of each stretch, the roll of the swell near one cape, the smell of seaweed off another, the color of the mud stirred by the tides. They spoke of places in terms of time and touch. 3 hours to the white cliffs, 1 watch to the island where the sea turns green. The chart was a story, a rhythm learned by a repetition until it became instinct. In the ports of the Mediterranean, apprentices were sent out to sea with elder pilots. They memorized not coordinates, but sensations, the echo of waves in certain coves, the cry of birds near safe harbor, the hue of clouds before storms. Each experience became a line in their mental map, the brotherhood of knowledge. Pilots formed a kind of brotherhood not formal, yet deeply bound by trust. Their reputations were sacred. To lose a ship was tragedy, to lose one's credibility was worse. In Venice, Genoa, and Marseille, these pilots were both respected and feared. Merchants depended on them, but they guarded their secrets jealously. Knowledge of a safe passage through reefs or of a hidden current could mean the difference between fortune and disaster. A pilot's memory was worth more than gold. When a new pilot sought to earn his place, he would be tested at sea. He had to describe the coastline blindfolded, to recognize landmarks by smell and sound alone, to navigate home in fog using nothing but the feel of the swell. Only then was he allowed to guide a ship for others. The Portolan Revolution. Around the 13th century, the world of pilots began to change. Their oral traditions gave birth to something astonishing, the Portolan chart. Unlike earlier, symbolic maps drawn by monks and scholars, Portolans were pragmatic. They were made by sailors, for sailors. Their coastlines were drawn with uncanny accuracy, not as sacred visions, but as working tools. Fine lines radiated across them like the threads of a spider's web, lines, showing the directions of known ways. Each chart began as a pilot's memory laid upon parchment. They did not attempt to show the whole earth, only what mattered. Ports, anchorages, dangerous reefs, and the compass bearings between them. The first of these maps appeared in Genoa and Majorca, where pilots and Jewish cartographers worked side by side. They used compasses, but they also relied on centuries of human observation, turning memory into geometry. For the first time, the sea could be shared on paper, the language of coasts. Every coastline had its dialect. Sailors learned the language of land, how cliffs looked from different angles, how mountains changed color at sunset, how the smell of earth shifted after rain. The English pilots spoke of white napes for chalk cliffs and dark heads for granite points. The Arabs had words for every type of sand and reef. The Norse named rocks by the sound of waves upon them. This vocabulary was not poetic fancy, but survival. To misread the land's language was to court shipwreck. The instruments of memory. Before writing instruments were trusted at sea, pilots made small mnemonic aids, bits of string with knots, shells, or wooden carvings that reminded them of certain routes. A piece of coral might mark a shallow. A knot might represent the distance between islands. Some used paletta, wooden boards with names of ports and bearings scratched upon them. Others carried rough sketches of coasts drawn on hides or planks, which they called routiers' routes. These were not books of science, but collections of memory. Each entry began like a story. From Cape St. Vincent, sail east by south until the sea grows dark. and the gulls cry twice. Then turn toward the dawn and you will see the heels of Almeria rise from the foam. The rowdies of the 14th century evolved into port books and pilot guides, the ancestors of modern sailing directions. The weight of experience. No compass could replace the senses of a veteran pilot. He read the tilt of waves like a scholar reads text. He could tell by the echo of a bell through fog how far he was from shore, by the hum of the rigging how strong the coming wind would be. There are tales of pilots who could hear sandbanks, the subtle hiss of breakers where no white water showed. Others could taste the salt of the sea and know which river's current they had entered. This intimacy with nature was earned through pain and patience. Many pilots lost friends and ships to reefs before mastering their craft. Every voyage carved another lesson into their minds. The faith of the sea. Though they worked with science and skill, pilots never stopped believing in providence. Before departure, they knelt on deck, touching the prow, praying for favor from both God and ocean. In southern Europe, they called upon Saint Nicholas, patron of sailors, in the north, Saint Brendan. Some carried amulets carved from whalebone or bits of lodestone. Others whispered charms to calm the sea's temper. To them, the ocean was not conquered, it was appeased. Their knowledge might guide them, but grace alone could save them. The pilot's legacy. When great explorers, Columbus, Diego Magellan set sail, they did not do so alone. They brought with them the wisdom of countless anonymous pilots. The routes those men discovered were often already known to generations of local sailors who had simply never written them down. Every line on the early world maps carried the ghost of a pilot's memory, the turn of a tide, the glimpse of a mountain, the pattern of birds at dusk. Without them, the age of discovery would have been impossible. And even as navigation grew more mathematical, the brotherhood of pilots endured. In every port, from Lisbon to Goa, from Bruges to Tunis, men still gathered at tavern tables, trading routes, rumors, and bits of weather-worn lore. Their craft was disappearing, but their spirit, the art of feeling the world through motion and memory, would never vanish. The mind as compass. In the end, the medieval pilot carried within him everything a sailor needed. The sky, the sea, the shore, the smell of wind, the weight of silence before a storm. His heart beat in rhythm with the tides. His eyes, always measuring, were more precise than any instrument. He did not think in degrees or minutes, but in moments, the exact second when the sea turned color, when the sun slipped behind a cloud, when the gulls began to circle homeward. He was the compass before the compass, the chart before the map, the memory of the world before it was written. And when he died, the sea took his knowledge back, one more current returning to the deep. As Europe's ships grew larger and voyages stretched beyond the sight of land, the medieval sailor's greatest ally became the sky itself. The sea could hide its secrets in fog and storm, but the heavens never lied. The stars were eternal, and those who learned to read their patterns could sail where no coastline guided them. Before compasses were trusted, before chronometers existed, mariners turned their faces upward each night to find their way home. In the dark stillness between waves, the sky became both chart and clock, a language of light written by the Creator for those patient enough to decipher it. The sky as scripture. In the monasteries, scholars copied astronomical texts in Latin, blending ancient Greek geometry with the theology of divine order. The firmament, they believed, was not chaos, but harmony, a perfectly tuned sphere of light. Every star had a place, every movement a meaning. To the sailor, this was not philosophy. It was survival. The heavens, for him, were less about metaphysics and more about direction. Yet the belief in cosmic order gave his art a sacred gravity. To know the stars was to touch the divine machinery of the world. A priest might read the Psalms, the sailor read the constellations. Both sought truth in patterns that seemed eternal. The North Star, the axis of the world. Polaris, the North Star, was the sailor's first and most faithful guide. Unlike other stars, it did not wander. Night after night, it held its place above the northern horizon, a steady mark amid the wheeling heavens. From the moment sailors learned to measure its height, even roughly, they could estimate their latitude. The higher it rose, the farther north they were; the lower, the closer to the equator. It was a miracle of consistency, a light so dependable that entire voyages depended upon it. But not all seas were blessed by its presence. Beyond the equator, Polaris sank below the horizon and vanished. To southern sailors, this absence was both practical loss and spiritual unease, as though the world's axis had slipped away. Arab and African mariners found other guides: the Southern Cross, the bright stars of Canopus, and Achernar. Each culture built its own compass of the heavens, the astrolabe and its kin. By the 12th century, instruments from the Islamic world began to arrive in Europe, among them the astrolabe, a marvel of brass and intellect. It was part clock, part map, part prayer wheel. By aligning its rotating plate with a star and reading its height above the horizon, a navigator could find his latitude with surprising precision. The astrolabe was born in the libraries of Baghdad and Cordoba, where astronomers had refined Greek science with new mathematics. From there it passed to Christian scholars, then to sailors, who adapted it for the rolling deck. The mariner's astrolabe, heavier and simpler, could withstand the sea's motion. With it, a pilot could measure the height of the pole star or the sun at noon. Each reading was a kind of communion, a moment when the heavens revealed their geometry to the human hand. The sun's road. Not every voyage relied on the stars. The sun, too, served as a compass, marking both direction and time. At dawn and dusk, its rising and setting gave a rough sense of east and west. At noon, when the sun reached its highest point, sailors could find true south in the northern hemisphere by noting where the shadow pointed shortest. With experience, men learned to track how high the sun climbed in each season. The height of noon became a measure of distance from the equator, just as the North Star did at night. Some carried small wooden quadrants or simple staffs to mark the angle between sun and horizon, the ancestors of the later cross staff and backstaff. These tools were crude, but in skilled hands they turned the sky into a vast, silent clock. The winds of heaven. The stars guided direction, but the winds decided destiny. Medieval sailors divided the sky not by compass degrees but by winds, 12, later 16, named and revered. The Greeks had once called them gods: Boreas, Zephyrus, Notus, Eurus. The Arabs gave them names like Shamal, Qibli, Garbi. By the time of the Crusades, sailors had blended these traditions into a common windrose, a circle of names radiating from the center of the world. Each wind had character. The north wind was cold and righteous. The south was languid and deceitful. The west brought change. The east carried omens. Sailors prayed to or cursed them, depending on their temper. In Portolan charts, the winds were drawn as radiating lines, their names written in graceful script: Tramontana, Levante, Sirocco, Poniente. They were not just meteorology, they were geography itself, the nocturnal and the star clock. As navigation grew more refined, new instruments appeared. The nocturnal, a small device of rotating discs, allowed sailors to tell time at night by the position of the Big Dipper around the pole star. By knowing the hour, they could also estimate their longitude roughly by dead reckoning. In practice, this was guesswork, but to the medieval mind, it bordered on magic. A sailor could stand on a dark deck, align his nocturnal, and declare the hour by the stars alone. Each instrument, from the astrolabe to the nocturnal, was not just a tool but a bridge between man and cosmos. They carried with them the echo of astronomy, astrology, and theology, the sense that to measure the heavens was to understand God's design. The ritual of observation. Night after night, the same ritual unfolded aboard ships from Lisbon to Alexandria. The helmsman kept his course by the stars while the pilot emerged from his cabin, holding his instrument like a priest his relic. The crew fell silent. He sighted the pole star through the frame, called for the hourglass to mark time, then murmured to his mate, "The height is 42 degrees. We are north of Lisbon but south of Brittany." In those moments, the ship became a temple of precision. Even as the waves hissed and the timbers creaked, the stars stood firm, eternal. When clouds hid the sky, the sailors grew restless. To lose sight of the heavens was to be blind, adrift in a world without measure. They prayed for the skies to clear, and when they did, the first star to pierce the clouds brought cheers, as though a long-lost friend had returned. The moral of the stars. For all their practicality, medieval men never separated navigation from faith. The stars were not random, they were signs. Their courses mirrored the order of heaven, and to follow them was to walk within divine intention. When a voyage succeeded, the crew gave thanks not only for calm seas, but for the guidance of celestial light. When storms struck, they searched the heavens for meaning. Had they angered the saints, or sailed beyond the world's ordained bounds? Theologians wrote that the stars were lamps set by God to lead the traveler. To disobey their guidance was arrogance, to trust them was humility. The memory of the sky. Every pilot carried in his mind the map of stars visible from his homeland. But as he sailed south, the heavens themselves changed. New constellations appeared, strange and unnamed. The sky became foreign. When Portuguese sailors first crossed the equator, they saw the Southern Cross for the first time. Many knelt upon the deck, awed and fearful. It was as if a new heaven had opened, testifying that the world was larger than Scripture had ever hinted. The sight of unfamiliar stars was both revelation and lost proof that their inherited maps, both earthly and celestial, were incomplete. The eternal compass. Though compasses would later dominate, the knowledge of celestial navigation never died. Even centuries later, when magnets and chronometers ruled, captains still taught apprentices to find north by Polaris, to judge noon by the sun, to read the sky's unchanging script. For in the end all instruments could fail, but the stars endured. They had no language, yet they spoke to every sailor who looked up from the black mirror of the sea. They needed no repair, no compass card, no lodestone. They were both science and solace, guiding not only ships, but the hearts of those who feared the endless dark. The medieval navigator looked upward and found there not just direction, but reassurance. Each star told him that the universe had meaning, that his fragile vessel, adrift on the immensity of the sea, was still part of an ordered creation. And as he steered by that eternal light, he joined the oldest brotherhood of all, those who trusted the heavens to lead them home. By the late Middle Ages, the sea was no longer just a border, it was a road. The pilots and star readers had prepared the way, and now the boldest captains began to dream of horizons beyond any map. Yet for every tale of discovery, there were dozens of lost ships, forgotten names, and whispered fears of what lay beyond the sight of land. In an age before compasses were common, to sail out of sight of the coast was an act of faith as much as skill. The sea was vast, hungry, and full of rumors, but it also called to men with promises of wealth, salvation, and immortality. The fear of the open sea. Even the most seasoned sailor of the 13th century felt unease when the last line of land faded into the haze. The coast was safety, a place to measure, to anchor, to rest. Out on the open sea, there was nothing to hold on to but memory and sky. The ocean's surface was not uniform. To the medieval eye it was alive with omens, streaks of dark water that hinted at depth, sudden calm patches where spirits were said to sleep, currents that pulled without reason. The sailors spoke of the White Sea and the Black Sea not by geography but by mood. At night, when clouds covered the stars, the crew whispered of Mare Tenebrosum, the sea of darkness. They said that ships who sailed too far into it were swallowed whole, their timbers found years later on distant shores, crusted with salt and mystery. No wonder they prayed before every voyage, lighting candles at shrines of St. Nicholas and St. Elmo, the shape of the world. Before the 15th century, most Europeans did not imagine the earth as flat in the childish sense often told today. Scholars knew the world was a sphere, but they believed the seas were ringed by impassable heat and monsters. The world of their maps was enclosed by theology as much as geography. Beyond the familiar zones of Christendom lay lands of marvel and danger, deserts where the air burned, oceans that boiled, cliffs that dropped into void. Sailors carried these beliefs with them even when their hands were steady and their eyes were clear. When the sea grew strangely warm or phosphorescent, they whispered that they were nearing the rim of the world. Yet curiosity fought with fear. For every legend that warned against sailing too far, there was another that promised riches, islands of gold, and fountains of youth waiting just beyond the horizon. The Atlantic pathfinders. Centuries before Columbus, men from northern Europe and the Mediterranean had already ventured far into the Atlantic. The Norse, driven by hunger and hard weather, crossed from Norway to Iceland, then to Greenland, and even to Vinland, the misty coast of North America. They had no compass, no charts of latitude or longitude. They steered by the sun's path, the color of water, the flight of seabirds, and the drift of ice. They learned the sound of whales that lingered near shallows, the direction of driftwood carried by unseen currents. To the south, the Portuguese and Genoese sailors began testing the edge of the known ocean. They hugged the African coast, moving from one cape to the next, mapping winds and tides with infinite patience. Each headland conquered became a new border of the known world. Each voyage was a conversation with the unknown. The Canary and Madeira mysteries. Long before the official age of exploration, sailors told stories of the Fortunate Isles, places of eternal spring, lying far out to the west. Some said they were the last remnants of Atlantis, others that they were gates to paradise. By the 1330s, Genoese and Portuguese expeditions had rediscovered them. The Canary Islands, Madeira, the Azores. But even then, each discovery was shadowed by legend. The sailors brought back tales of giant birds, black sands that burned the feet, and mountains that sang in the wind. These islands became stepping stones into the great western void. To reach them was to test courage. To sail beyond them was to risk eternity. Navigation without compass. To cross such distances without a compass required a different kind of sight. One trained in patterns invisible to ordinary eyes. The pilots followed the path of swells, great, slow waves that rolled in steady directions across thousands of miles. They noted how these waves met the hull, how their rhythm shifted with the wind. In calm weather, the sea itself became a compass, pointing the way through touch and sound. They also watched the sky not just for stars, but for cloud lines, long streaks that often formed above islands long before the land was visible. The flight of birds, especially terns and petrels, revealed coasts over the horizon. At dawn, the smell of earth sometimes reached them hours before sight. Experienced men could tell if it was dry land, forest, or swamp by scent alone. These subtle cues formed a network of signs, a system as sophisticated as any magnetic compass, but written in nature. The whispering currents. The Atlantic was not still. Invisible rivers flowed within it, slow but unstoppable. The Canary Current, the North Equatorial Drift, the Gulf Stream. Medieval sailors did not name them scientifically, but they felt them. They spoke of the sea that pushes and the sea that pulls. A ship might move even when no wind blew. At first they thought it sorcery, or the breath of leviathans. Later they realized that these streams could be allies, carrying them home when the winds refused. The knowledge of these currents spread quietly, passed between generations of pilots. A man might never write his discovery down, but his apprentice would learn to sense it in the roll of the deck. The return voyage, the hardest art. To sail away from home was difficult. To return was divine. The medieval sailor had to understand not just one path but two, how the world's winds and waters reversed. In the Atlantic, this meant sailing outward with the northeast trades, then finding the westerlies higher up to come back. This pattern, the great circular dance of the winds, was not known to scholars, but to the men of the sea. By trial and death, they learned to trust this secret rhythm, that the earth itself turned like a wheel beneath them, its breath drawing them home. The lost voyages. Not all who sailed returned. There are records of ships that left Lisbon, Bristol, or Venice and vanished into the west. Their names were written in parish books, their fates guessed at in taverns. One chronicler from the 14th century tells of a fleet of 13 vessels that sailed under Prince of Portugal, seeking the island of the Seven Cities. Only one ship returned, its crew starving and half-mad, claiming they had seen towers rising from the sea, towers made of light. Another story tells of an English ship blown far west by a storm, finding a land with red cliffs and sweet water. They gathered wood and filled their barrels, and then the wind turned against them, never letting them leave. Such tales were dismissed by scholars, but sailors kept them alive. Each voyage that disappeared left behind a new rumor of what lay beyond the known. The courage of ignorance. To us, it seems impossible that men without compasses, charts, or instruments dared to cross entire oceans. But they did, guided by courage and instinct. They trusted the sky, the wind, the sea's voice. They accepted that death was part of the journey, and when they returned sunburned, salt-scarred, carrying bits of strange wood or shells never seen before, they became living proof that the world was wider than anyone had dreamed. Their voyages did not yet reshape maps or empires, but they changed something deeper, the human idea of distance. The edge of the world was no longer a place. It was a challenge, the sea's memory. Each ship that left harbor carried not only men but centuries of learning, the whispers of pilots, the faith of star watchers, the instincts of fishermen. Their courage was not reckless, but built on layers of inherited craft. Every voyage, whether lost or triumphant, fed the ocean's growing map, drawn not in ink but in memory. And by the time compasses became common, and explorers set out under royal banners, the invisible groundwork was already there. The medieval sailors, unnamed and unrecorded, had charted the world with their fear, their skill, and their stubborn will to return. They had turned the sea itself into a teacher. By the early 15th century, the medieval sailor stood at the crossroads of tradition and innovation. Generations of pilots had learned the secrets of the sea, reading clouds, currents, and stars as naturally as breathing. Now, new inventions began to appear, tools that could amplify human skill, yet demanded understanding and care. The sailor who survived the ocean in this age was neither wholly magician nor wholly engineer. He was both, blending instinct with invention. The sunstone and polar light. In the far north, where days could vanish behind storms and fog, Viking mariners had long used a remarkable stone to find the sun, the sunstone, likely a form of calcite or Iceland spar. Even when clouds obscured the sun entirely, the crystal revealed its position by polarizing the light. The method was subtle. Hold the stone aloft, rotate it, and note which orientation caused it to glow most brightly. Even in dense fog or snow, the sun's position could be determined to within a few degrees. To medieval sailors, it seemed like sorcery, a small shard of crystal that could command the heavens. By combining the sunstone with the patterns of clouds and the motion of the sea, northern pilots could navigate far beyond coastal waters, reaching islands in the North Atlantic that would otherwise remain hidden. Shadows as guides. Even without instruments, shadows offered guidance. At noon, the shortest shadow pointed due north-south. By comparing the sun's height to known seasonal patterns, sailors could gauge latitude. Some carried shadow sticks, simple vertical rods marked with gradations. Others relied on more subtle techniques. A finger held up to measure angles, or the ship's mast used as a makeshift gnomon. These methods demanded patience and constant attention. A small error could drift a ship miles off course. But with careful observation, shadows became a silent compass, faithful when the magnetic needle failed or the stars were hidden. The cross-staff and backstaff. To refine latitude measurement, mariners adopted tools such as the cross-staff, a simple yet elegant device. By sliding a horizontal crosspiece along a vertical staff, the navigator could measure the altitude of the sun or a star above the horizon. Later, the backstaff allowed sailors to keep the sun behind them, reducing glare while taking readings. Though these instruments were rudimentary by modern standards, they represented a leap, the ability to translate angles in the sky into usable guidance at sea. Pilots still combined these readings with memory, cloud patterns, wind direction, currents, and coastal shapes. The instruments enhanced judgment, but never replaced it. The magnetic needle. By this time, the compass had become more common in European ports. The dry compass, mounted in a box and suspended on gimbals, allowed sailors to read direction in rough seas. Yet early navigators knew its limits. Iron nails in the hull could deflect the needle. Storms could cause temporary deviations. The compass provided guidance, but it was not infallible. Every master pilot treated it as one voice among many: the stars, the sun, the waves, the wind, and the currents. Celestial and terrestrial memory. The combination of instrument and instinct gave rise to a new skill: celestial and terrestrial memory. Pilots noted the position of stars at specific times and linked them to coasts or hazards. For example, the rising of a certain star might coincide with a hidden shoal. A shadow of a mast at noon could confirm the ship's latitude, while the drift of a current verified the calculations. These connections were memorized, passed from one generation to the next. Even with compasses and astrolabes, a ship could not survive if the pilot had not internalized the patterns of sea and sky. Instruments provided measurements. Memory provided survival. Learning the currents. No instrument could fully capture the power of ocean currents. Sailors relied on observation, floating debris, the drift of seaweed, and the direction of foam lines. The Gulf Stream, the North Equatorial Drift, and coastal eddies were all sensed before they were ever charted. Medieval pilots could detect subtle changes in wave rhythm that hinted at underwater ridges or shifting sandbanks. By combining the observations of wind, wave, and current, they developed a mental map of the sea itself, a dynamic chart that changed with each voyage. Winds as a tool. Winds were not only obstacles, they were guides. Experienced sailors memorized seasonal patterns, local gusts, and long-distance trade winds. The monsoon in the Indian Ocean dictated trade routes, while the northeast trades and westerlies controlled Atlantic passages. Pilots used these winds to plan departures and returns, even calculating the approximate duration of a voyage based on wind persistence. In many ways, the medieval sailor thought in wind and wave rather than miles. Every journey was a negotiation with the elements. Observation is ritual. Every morning, sailors measured the sun's height, checked the needle, and observed the sky. At night, they read the stars and listened to the swell. Each observation was ritual, combining science, art, and faith. Pilots recorded what they could, while much remained in memory. These daily practices formed a cumulative wisdom, one that allowed European sailors to venture further each century. The dawn of accuracy. By carefully combining sunstones, shadows, compasses, and instruments, medieval sailors achieved remarkable precision. Though they lacked longitude measurements and sophisticated charts, they could cross hundreds of miles of open ocean with confidence. This era laid the groundwork for the Age of Discovery. The techniques developed in northern and southern seas, refined over generations, became the tools that allowed Columbus, da Gama, and others to sail beyond the known world. Nature and invention in balance. The medieval mariner's genius lay in balance, trusting the inventions of men while never forgetting the lessons of the natural world. A sunstone or compass could enhance skill, but without a pilot's memory, instincts, and observation, such tools were worthless. Sailors did not rely solely on devices. They relied on the conversation between human and environment. The wind, the waves, the stars, the sun, and even the smell of the air were part of the navigation process. The instruments were amplifiers, not replacements, of the sailor's senses. The legacy of mastery. By the early 15th century, navigation had become a discipline. equal parts art, science, and tradition. Every voyage added to the shared knowledge of the seas. This foundation would enable the great explorations of the later 15th and 16th centuries. But it would always carry the imprint of its earliest practitioners, the medieval pilots who listened to the world, read the heavens, and trusted the pulse of the sea. They had taught the world that direction is not only measured but felt, and that survival on the oceans requires both invention and intuition. Even with stars, currents, compasses, and instruments, the sea remained a realm of danger. Medieval sailors understood that knowledge could only go so far. Beyond the safety of known ports and charted coasts, the ocean was a living, unpredictable force, and every voyage was a negotiation with risk. Storms, the unseen masters. Storms were the most immediate and terrifying threat. Unlike modern meteorology, medieval sailors had only observation, intuition, and memory to predict the weather. Clouds, wind patterns, the smell of rain, the behavior of birds, all were carefully studied. They recognized signs, a sudden drop in temperature, a shift in wind direction, the appearance of high cirrus clouds signaling change. Yet even the best pilots could be surprised. Storms could rise in minutes, transforming calm seas into a boiling chaos of wind and wave. The language of storms was rich in metaphor. A gale might be described as the breath of demons, or the anger of saints. A tempest could be foretold by a stillness in the air, a deceptive calm that hid the approaching fury. Sailors prepared by reefing sails, securing cargo, and praying for skill alone might not suffice. Reefs and shoals. Coastal navigation, though seemingly simpler than open ocean sailing, carried its own perils. Hidden shoals, shifting sandbanks, and jagged reefs claimed countless ships. Even well-charted harbors could change with the tides and seasons. Pilots memorized every inlet and bay, noting depths and landmarks. A miscalculation of tides could strand a ship on a sandbar, where rising waters would crush it against rocks. Some hazards were marked by small beacons or fires. Many were learned only by tragedy. Maps, when available, showed these dangers crudely. Much relied on local knowledge, oral instruction, and the repeated observation of those who had traveled the routes before. Fog and mist. In northern waters, dense fog could erase the horizon. Stars and sun became invisible, and the compass was sometimes the only guide. Sailors developed acute senses for subtle cues, the lapping of waves against the hull, the smell of land, and the cries of seabirds that indicated proximity to shore. Fog was often anthropomorphized in folklore, imagined as spirits of the dead or mischievous sea creatures. Sailors respected it as both a natural and supernatural obstacle. Navigating blind required courage, intuition, and deep familiarity with the sea. Ice and cold. In northern latitudes, ice was a constant hazard. Drifting floes, hidden icebergs, and frozen spray could destroy wooden vessels. The Vikings had long learned to read the patterns of ice and snow, understanding which currents carried ice south and which led safely around it. Ice was not only physical danger, it was psychological. The endless whiteness, the freezing temperatures, and the isolation tested both endurance and morale. Survival required knowledge, discipline, and teamwork. Pirates and hostile shores. Beyond natural threats, sailors faced human dangers. Pirates and hostile forces along trade routes added another layer of risk. Mediterranean and Atlantic waters were rife with raiders who attacked ships, stole cargo, and sometimes held crews for ransom. Pilots had to plan routes that minimized exposure, and captains learned to combine speed, stealth, and diplomacy. Maps included safe harbors and dangerous stretches, but in a world without consistent law enforcement at sea, much depended on vigilance and cunning. Disease and starvation. Long voyages brought not only storms and rocks but disease and hunger. Water went stale, food spoiled, and scurvy claimed lives before the cause was understood. Sailors had to ration supplies carefully, and knowledge of edible plants, safe harbors, and fishing was vital. A navigator's skill included anticipating where the ship might find fresh water or safe anchorage. Pilots memorized coastal landmarks not only for direction, but for survival. The limits of knowledge. Medieval sailors were brilliant observers, but their knowledge had limits. Unknown currents, uncharted reefs, sudden storms each posed unpredictable threats. Even the most experienced pilot could fail. This uncertainty shaped their worldview. The sea was a teacher, sometimes cruel, sometimes generous. Every mistake was a lesson. Every near-disaster story passed on to apprentices. Ships that survived brought not only goods but wisdom back to port. The role of faith. Faith was inseparable from navigation. Pilots and crews prayed before departure, during storms, and when nearing dangerous coasts. Saints, relics, and holy symbols were carried on deck. Saint Nicholas was invoked, Saint Elmo's fire considered a sign, and other regional saints were called upon to protect travelers. Even experienced navigators recognized that human skill could only go so far. The balance between knowledge and faith defined the medieval sailor's approach. Respect the sea, trust your senses, and pray for mercy. The courage to explore. Despite these dangers, men continued to sail beyond the familiar. Each voyage was an act of courage, an embrace of uncertainty. The rewards were great: trade, fame, exploration, and the possibility of discovering lands unseen. It was this willingness to face storms, reefs, fog, ice, disease, and pirates that made the age of discovery possible. Without the courage and skill of medieval sailors, the world beyond Europe would have remained unknown for much longer. Lessons carried forward. The dangers of the sea shaped the evolution of navigation. They drove the development of instruments, charts, and techniques, and they forged a culture of observation, memory, and adaptability. Medieval sailors understood that knowledge alone could not guarantee safety. Survival required humility, vigilance, and the willingness to learn from each voyage. In this delicate balance of skill, observation, faith, and courage, the foundations were laid for the explorers who would cross oceans and reshape the world. Even in the face of storms and darkness, medieval mariners pressed onward, the silent architects of global navigation. By the early 15th century, centuries of careful observation, practice, and innovation had transformed the art of medieval navigation into something approaching a science. The pilots who memorized coastlines, read the stars, interpreted winds, and sensed the currents had laid a foundation upon which the age of exploration would be built. Yet it was not a sudden revolution. It was the slow accumulation of knowledge, blended with courage, faith, and ingenuity. From local knowledge to shared charts. For centuries, navigation had been largely oral. Pilots' knowledge was closely guarded, passed from master to apprentice. Maps were rough, limited, and often secret. But as trade expanded and voyages lengthened, the need for shared information grew. Portal charts became increasingly sophisticated. These maps depicted coastlines with unprecedented accuracy, marked harbors, shoals, and currents, and overlaid them with compass roses to indicate wind directions. Each chart represented countless voyages and observations, converting the ephemeral knowledge of pilots into something permanent. Merchants, sailors, and scholars began exchanging charts and notes, creating networks of maritime intelligence. By combining experience with written records, navigation became more reliable, though still demanding skill, courage, and intuition. Instruments refined. The tools of navigation evolved alongside experience. The compass was now standard on most European ships, its gimbaled housing keeping it steady in rough seas. Astrolabes and nocturnals allowed measurement of latitude by stars or the sun, while cross-staffs and backstaffs offered practical methods for reading angles above the horizon. Northern mariners continued to use sunstones, while southern pilots perfected techniques for observing the Southern Cross. Every instrument required careful calibration, skilled observation, and a deep understanding of natural phenomena. Instruments enhanced the pilot's knowledge but did not replace it. Intuition, memory, and observation remained essential, combining the old and the new. What defined the best medieval navigators was their ability to merge inherited wisdom with new technologies. They never relied on a single method. Compass, stars, sun, winds, waves, currents, and coastal features were all read simultaneously. Each element acted as a check against the others. This holistic approach allowed for extraordinary achievements. Pilots could venture beyond familiar waters, out of sight of land for weeks at a time, and still reach distant ports safely. Their work was not merely technical, it was artful, requiring judgment, patience, and courage. Lessons from the edge of the known world. The first oceanic voyages beyond the Mediterranean and North Atlantic to the Azores, Canary Islands, Madeira, and the African coast were made possible by these accumulated skills. Each successful journey demonstrated that knowledge of nature, when carefully observed and applied, could extend human reach across the seas. But these voyages were also reminders of the sea's perils. Storms, fog, reefs, pirates, disease, and hunger remained constant threats. The medieval mariner's success lay in combining preparation, observation, instruments, memory, and faith. Every journey carried risk, yet each completed voyage built confidence, knowledge, and maps for those who would follow. The human factor. No matter how sophisticated the instruments or charts became, the human element remained decisive. The pilot's experience, judgment, and courage determined whether the ship reached its destination or was lost. Knowledge was cumulative, but wisdom required the touch of a skilled navigator. Faith and superstition also played a role. Medieval sailors prayed for guidance and protection, interpreting omens from the weather, stars, and natural phenomena. Their rituals were part of the broader system of understanding and surviving the sea, an acknowledgement that even the most careful preparation could not guarantee safety. A world becoming smaller. By the end of the medieval period, Europe's perception of the world had changed. No longer confined to local coasts and regional seas, mariners imagined routes to distant lands. The ocean was no longer an unknowable void but a series of connected spaces, each with patterns, rhythms, and lessons to teach those willing to observe carefully. The horizon was expanding, and with it human ambition. Pilots and early explorers were ready to sail further than anyone had dared, prepared to turn knowledge, courage, and skill into voyages of unprecedented scope. The legacy of medieval navigation. The work of centuries of mariners, pilots, and scholars created the foundation for global exploration. Instruments, charts, and techniques were tools, but the true secret lay in human observation, memory, and adaptability. The medieval sailor had learned to read the invisible currents of wind, water, and stars, to anticipate danger, and to navigate uncertainty with skill and faith. When explorers like Columbus, da Gama, and Magellan embarked on voyages across oceans unknown to Europeans, they carried with them not just instruments and maps, but the accumulated wisdom of medieval navigation. Every success and survival owed itself to the silent labor of generations who had learned to understand and respect the sea as teacher. Ultimately, the medieval mariners taught the world the most enduring lesson, that the ocean is both danger and opportunity, discipline and freedom, teacher and adversary. Their methods, blending instinct, observation, instruments, and faith, were a testament to human ingenuity and resilience. The medieval sailor's horizon may have seemed limited at the time, but through careful study and daring, he opened the way for humanity to embrace a global perspective, to sail not only for trade, war, or faith, but to see the world in its vast, connected totality. The compass, the stars, the sun, the wind, and the waves, these were the tools, yes, but the heart of navigation was human, patient, perceptive, courageous, and endlessly curious. And with that combination, the world became smaller, more navigable, and filled with possibilities previously unimaginable.